Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We are Project Muse. My name is Christina Zavala, and I am the Senior Director for Imperial County SELPA. Project Muse is improving outcomes for multilingual students with exceptional needs. This project is funded in partnership with CDE and CCEE, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. We are a special education resource lead. We are part of the statewide system of support, and this is day 4, session 4 of our series of a tiered approach to accessibility. Day 4 consists of focusing on the team lift, a multidisciplinary approach to accessible and equitable IEPs. So we are so grateful that you're here with us today for a full day of continuing to learn how to grow and create equity and access, accessibility, inclusion, and belonging for our dually identified students, our students with disabilities that are multilingual learners. To get started today, our resources can be found here via the QR code and the bit.ly link in which you can access the presentation slides. And thank you to our Zoom friends. I'll give you a second to access the slide deck. And today, this is a hybrid presentation. Gratefully, we have our local friends that are here today in person, and then we have our Zoom friends joining us from across the beautiful state of California. And we thank you so much for taking this day to join us today. So moving forward, also this slide here will present to you how you can follow us via social media. We have a X account, which was formerly known as Twitter. You can find us at EL_SWD. Please follow us so you can engage and participate and comment and share our collective commitment to supporting our dually identified students and have access to any upcoming professional development or conference events. Again, we value your participation. Please engage via the Zoom chat, and the question and answer feature will be on as well. So we have our team that is manning the chat. We will be tag teaming throughout the session today, so please engage, ask any questions, and again, access our website after today so you can follow up with any questions particular to your district or your local needs. This is our planning day for today. We're starting at 8:30 right on the dot and ending the day at 3 o'clock. And here are the scheduled breaks. We'll be taking a lunch at 11:30 today and coming back an hour lunch, coming back at 12:30, and then again ending the day at 3. So however you plan, be sure to participate via Zoom. If you have to take a quick break, it's all right. We're just so grateful for you to join us for a full day of learning. This is our small but mighty team. Again, my name's Christina Zavala. I'm the Senior Director for Imperial County SELPA. We have Dr. Deborah Montoya that serves as our Executive Consultant for this project. And today our presenters will be Lupita Holguin Rubio, SELPA Coordinator, and also Vanessa Lopez, one of our SELPA coordinators. And again, the structure of our team is very intentional. We also have various backgrounds in the field of special education and English language development. My background has been serving as a school psychologist for the past 15 years. And also I bring to the team some expertise in assistive technology as well, and best practices in the area of assessment and culturally and linguistically appropriate assessment practices. Dr. Deborah Montoya also has her background in the area of school psychology, and Lupita is I'd say our expert in all things English language development. She also served as a general education teacher for the past 20 years has been working in the field of English language development, and Vanessa Lopez also served as a special education teacher for 20 years, an EL coach, and also has her credential in adaptive physical education, and is certified in completing assistive technology assessments as well. So we bring to you our multidisciplinary team and encourage you to bring and build up your teams within your own districts and LEAs as well. So to get started, I am going to pass the mic over to Lupita, and she will be getting us started. And as we pass over the mic, please engage in Zoom. Add in the chat your name, who's in the house today, what district or COE or SELPA you are currently working in, and your position. And also we'll be asking our friends here in person. So we'll give you just a couple minutes to participate in the chat and let us know who's here joining us today. Thank you so much.
Christina, I'm just checking the mic. Thank you, Christina, and welcome everybody. Welcome our friends from Imperial Valley and as well our friends from Zoom. As stated earlier, this is the last day of a 4-part series, all things related to accessibility. Our intent for today is to provide you an opportunity. Thank you, I'm gonna need that. Provide you an opportunity to, and space and time, the gift of time, to really bring all of the pieces together. Many of you might be joining as a team. Some of you are joining as individuals. Either way, this is a collective effort statewide. As stated earlier, we are part of the statewide system of support, and this round of our grant work, we're offered the opportunity to be intentional in our work with our other partners at the state level, the other state agencies that are offered this charge to help and support you all, through in your different roles in support of special education students statewide. So we want to kind of trickle that sentiment down in our work as well and provide opportunities for us to learn together, invite you to participate as teams. And if you're not there yet, it's absolutely okay, because I'm gonna quote Vanessa, every little step forward is a step forward. And so if you are not part of a team, if you are not part of a multidisciplinary team in this work, or you feel like somebody else should be here, or I wish I had a partner that I could, collaborate with from the other camp. If you're a SPED teacher, referring to a gen ed, a friend, or vice versa, you're in the right place. You're in the right place, and we're hopeful that our support and our resources and opportunities such as these are paving a path in that direction of really developing a collective commitment, what we often refer to as a multidisciplinary team approach. Our hope is that by the end of the day, you are given the opportunity through our resources and time to pull together many of the tools that we've offered you through this series and really put them together. Think of them as puzzle pieces, and looking at your respective landscape, how can we pull those pieces together? And if there are some missing pieces per se, that's okay, right? Where might I be able to move or next step so that I can fill that that gap? So in the spirit of the multidisciplinary team and the spirit of collective commitment, as I stated earlier, we are part of the statewide system of support, and our funders, the California Department of Education, the California Collective for Educational Excellence, they are being very intentional in helping us, the state agencies, work together. And they're encouraging us, they're supporting us, they're giving us space and time to do that. And so we want to be able to emulate that in our scope of work and activities that we offer to the field. Again, this is a collective commitment, and we cannot do this very important work without each other's support. So again, if you're here as a team, that's amazing. If you are a small team of one and you are of that mindset where I need to reach out to my counterparts or my administrator or my direct report to be able to begin this conversation, then you are absolutely in the right place. So quick recap, and again, some resources for you as we round out our year of this series. This slide will give you access, direct access to all the recordings from the previous days. The link at the bottom takes you to our landing page where we house all of our pre-recorded modules since the inception of our grant, but we wanted to make them accessible to you here in this slide deck. So just a real quick recap of our time here together. Our first day together, we titled it Laying Down the Foundation because we wanted to start with some common understanding, some common language to begin to pave this journey. So our day one was all about these best practices and frameworks that are designed for student success. And as we built on that, the next day, the following session, our key topics were what is inclusion and what is accessibility, and how do we know which is which, and how can we tell that we are in the pathway towards inclusion, and is it just only about accessibility? Does accessibility make it inclusive? So I felt that was a really profound question, and in retrospect, I'm thinking that it really depends on the context and what that looks like and how students are engaging, not only in the classroom, accessing content, but also throughout, inside and outside of the classroom. And our last day, we had our friends, our partners at the state level, open access, come and offer us an overview of their project resources, and then a deep dive into some of those resources as well. I felt like it was a really awesome day. We had an opportunity to dive into those amazing resources and get a better understanding of what accessibility is, what assistive technology is, and what it could look like for students with extensive needs. So as we round out the day, our focus today is all about the multidisciplinary team. Right? We started with that in mind, and we're going to close with that in mind. Just by, maybe you can give us a thumbs up in the Zoom room, and those of you here live with us, how many of you are part or have been part of a multidisciplinary team approach respective to your role? If you're a special education teacher or general education teacher, do you feel that you have been or are part of a multidisciplinary team when it comes to addressing the needs of a struggling student and or a student with an IEP? Just show me with a thumbs up here in person, and in the Zoom room, Vanessa will monitor that. So, and if you're not sure, really sure, I think so, I'm not sure, you can do like a sideways thumb. Or if you're not, you feel like definitely not, this is not something that we're practicing yet, it's quite all right. So again, our approach, by design, our team is a multidisciplinary team. Why? Because in order to do this work, addressing the needs of dually identified students, we need those lenses. Specifically, the EL perspective, the EL, I always hesitate to say expert, the EL expert lens, the EL specialist lens, and the special education lens. Now that special education lens is multifaceted, right? Depending on the student's needs, depending on the student's qualifying disability or disabilities, you may need a multiple lens approach with the special education lens in mind. The student may have a health impairment. The student may have a physical impairment. The student may have an intellectual disability. And so therefore, you need the experts that are assigned and trained to support and to be able to give some feedback and some best practices based on their area of need. So it is complex. It absolutely is complex, and it does require intentionality based on the student's needs. So quick recap, why is it that is our focus? Why are dually identified students our focus? If you've been with us more than once, you may have seen this particular slide more than once. And it's important for us to share and remind folks the sense of urgency as to why it's important to talk about linguistic supports for our dually identified students. 25% of students with an IEP in the state of California are also classified as English learners. And because they are also classified as English learners, they are required, our institutions, our LEAs, our schools or districts, and those of us that work in these schools and districts are mandated to provide support both in Title III, meaning EL services, as well as IDEA. Right? So students need to receive these types of services in order to make gains, in order to ensure that they are receiving the appropriate tools to have access to the content and the curriculum and to all of the programs and instructional supports that all the other children are offered. So it's important for us to recognize that this is a significant percentage of students at the state level. I ask you to think about what does this percentage look like at your site. And if it's comparable, if it's more, if it's less, identify who those kiddos are so that we can apply that multidisciplinary team approach to how we serve them. The second slide again is a comparison of, again, statewide, English learners statewide, English learners with a disability statewide, and I often call out two particular areas in these pie charts. One of them is the reclassification percentage, and we can see here that 45% of English learners at the state level are being reclassified, meaning that they are exiting their EL status. In other words, they've already met English language development, English language acquisition proficiency comparable to their English-only speaking peers at 45%, meaning almost half of our English learners are reclassifying, whereas English learners with a disability are being reclassified at less than 30%. So it does cause pause, and my brain wants to ask why, who are they, what does ELD look like, who's trained to support them, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece of those pie charts that I'd like to look at and that cause pause is the long-term English learner, the gray section in the pie charts. So at the state level, English learners are becoming long-term English learners at 11%, whereas an English learner with a disability becomes a long-term English learner. Almost 30% of them are becoming long-term English learners. So very quickly, what is a long-term English learner? A long-term English learner is an English learner who has been in an American school system for 6 years or more and has not made adequate progress, neither linguistically or academically. So they're not progressing academically, they're not progressing linguistically, and those two go hand in hand. If kids are not accessing the English language, they're going to struggle to access the content in English, right? No brainer. So this percentage is significant. It's significant. And what does that mean? It means that by the time kids get to middle school and high school, where the content is very dense, where the academic language is very complex, where your textbooks go from this size to this size, and the assignments and homework, all of that, very, very intense, very complex, students will not have access. And if that gap persists, it could have an impact not only in their educational career, but afterwards. They may not feel prepared or be prepared to continue their education. They may even drop out, right? So we need to consider the impact that these percentages have. And again, this is at the state level. What might this look like at your site? Who are those students? And what might we be able to do through the multidisciplinary team approach to begin to make strides in addressing their needs and impacting these percentages for the better? So why is it important to have a multidisciplinary team approach in this work? I would argue that the answer is obvious, right? Because students are multifaceted. The more we know and understand about our students, they're an English learner, there's been trauma in the family, there's food insecurity, the better we will be able to approach and connect the appropriate services, again, to enhance their educational career. So today is all about understanding who our students are. One more piece of data regarding state data regarding English learners with disabilities. These are the qualifying categories for special education services. The top three, specific learning disability, speech and language, and autism, are the highest, where we see the highest percentage of English learners qualifying for special education. Those of you in special education who are trained in special education will very quickly identify that those top three qualifying categories have an underlying factor of language, meaning, and Vanessa, help me out here if I misspeak, meaning that there's either a language processing disorder.
Yeah, so on the surface, students who have been assessed and been found eligible as needing supports related to disability categories, SLD, SLI, or autism, might look like it is related to language. So when we are considering what our topic is today, the importance of the multidisciplinary team, it would be important to have a person who has deep understanding of language acquisition in general and second language learning as well as having an ELD TOSA, ELD specialist to help us tease out those rather nuanced conversations around what are we looking at here? Are we looking at a language difference or a potential learning disability? Again, highly important to have experts at the table that would be able to have this very critical and nuanced conversation.
Right, thank you. And I think this is a really good example of why we need each other. So my lens, not having that deep, rich background in special education, I'm going to lean on the Vanessas in the world, right? To help to connect me, to meet me where I'm at, so that I, through the EL lens, let's say I'm the EL specialist in that multidisciplinary team, that I can identify, okay, I can see speech and language impairment. I can see how that may be something that I can pick up on, right? If I hear things like, well, the student has an accent and therefore, it's not proper English. I can pump the brakes and say, well, an accent will not impact academic language. It will not impact academic English language acquisition, and it will not impact access. It's how the teacher utilizes strategies and best practices to access the content, to develop academic English. It has nothing to do with the accent. So I can bring that information to the table, and a speech pathologist can contribute to that by explaining what are some of the characteristics that may, in this particular scenario for this child who qualifies for speech and language services, what it is and what it isn't, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So it's important for us to consider who needs to be at the table based on what the student is bringing to the table. And again, our approach, our recommendation is not of a deficit model, because being an English learner is not a disability, but it's more about, let's learn more about what the student needs, what he or she is able to do, and what are the basic requirements, right, for us to be able to provide those supports, meaning ELD, comprehensive ELD. So again, outside of the special education lens, English learners are a diverse group, right? It's not cookie cutter. An emerging student, meaning a student who is at the first phase of acquiring English language, may bring different skill sets to the table, depending on whether or not they've had formal schooling, whether or not they are a newcomer to the country. So all of those factors will have an impact on where the student is and how quickly he or she progresses. So English learners are a diverse group. And so looking beyond what we see on our rosters, what we see on our grade books, and or what we hear around the table when a student is struggling, it's important for us to do a little bit of investigative work. And we have provided and offered some resources. We're going to revisit those resources today. Again, laying out the tools, inviting those that have the expertise, that lens that is necessary for the student's needs to the table, so that we can depersonalize the conversation about what are going to be the best resources, the best supports for the student today, whether or not regardless of where we are in that phase of referral. We may be talking about a student at the very beginning who is struggling and doing some investigative work, providing appropriate resources, and engaging those that have that lens and that expertise so that we are ensuring that we are doing our very best so that the student does succeed. And when and if the student doesn't, then we know that we've offered every support possible, and we can justifiably and in good faith move forward with a special education assessment, knowing that language, in this case of an English learner, is not what we are assessing or what we are not considering in the assessment process. So a multidisciplinary team approach to this work, to addressing the needs of dually identified students, requires that the folks that are at the table, literally and figuratively, contribute to and have an opportunity to connect and provide the appropriate supports for the students' needs. Because we know English learners are a diverse group, because we've learned that English learners with a disability are a significant percentage of students that we are working with that are at our school sites, and because we know that the disability categories themselves are complex, it's important to bring those multiple lenses to the table and have the conversations about what is going to be the best support and services for this individual child. So it's a team lift approach. It's a team lift approach, and we cannot do this work well alone. In order to do better, we learn better, we do better, right? So it's important to take all of those pieces into consideration. We're going to revisit, this is a slide that we've shared with you. I think we shared it with you on our first day. So we're kind of going to loop back to different elements of the days and to, really bring this together. So this is our special education eligibility pre-referral wheel, and you'll recall that it has multiple steps. We're going to focus in on the pre-referral process, and we're going to take a closer look at the first steps of the pre-referral process. So like everything else in our slide deck, you have direct access to the resources directly from the slide deck, and I think Vanessa will be dropping them in the chat box as well as we speak to them specifically. So we're going to move forward, and we're going to take a look at the pre-referral process through these four-step approach. And as we move through the pre-referral process, through this four-step approach, I really want to ask you to think about, put yourself in your context, in your landscape, and ask yourself, what does the pre-referral process look like in my site, in my district, and what is my role, and how might we be able to enhance it? What is within your respective sphere of influence to be able to enhance it? So I'm asking you to navigate through this process, this resource rather, that we've shared with you before, but now through the lens of, what is our next step? How might I be able to contribute to enhance the pre-referral process through the lens of the multidisciplinary team approach? And I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa, who's going to walk us through that.
Okay, tag I'm it. All right, everybody. So as Lupita mentioned, what we're going to do is we're going to loop back into some of the topics that we touched on earlier on day 1, day 2, and day 3, because I think it's important for us to connect the dots for everyone. It's very easy to get overwhelmed when we start thinking of things as being unrelated, but once we start seeing that through line, it starts to make sense and things sort of start landing where they should, and then that connectedness really does provide the pathway to be able to start building this multidisciplinary team approach. So although we're looking at this at the context of pre-referral, I want to let you know that the multidisciplinary team approach really does apply to multiple facets of the educational trajectory of our students with disabilities, English learners, and English learners with disabilities. So when we're looking at taking a multidisciplinary team approach, it's something that
is going to be helpful for the team. And what I want you to think of right now is when you're thinking of the referral conversations, who makes up your multidisciplinary team? If I'm honest, and if I reference what my experience had been in the past, it was usually 2 individuals. Your admin and the teacher who had the concern. And that becomes very dangerous because then it becomes an echo chamber, and where we're just circulating 2 points of view. Well-intentioned, absolutely, no doubt about that. Let's try to get the student what they need. They're not being successful, but we need multiple lenses. When we think of the referral process, we're thinking of a classroom teacher who is observing that the student is having some difficulty with the content. If the student is an English learner and that teacher doesn't feel prepared to provide information related to what English language acquisition looks like, what those levels might look like, what it looks like in listening, speaking, reading, writing, we're missing critical elements of the discussion. If we don't have the math teacher there to have the conversation, and it's only English language arts, but most of the difficulty is happening in math, not necessarily in ELA, we would need that viewpoint there. Now, I'm not saying that we can snap our fingers and subs magically appear so that everybody can be present, but intentionality is key. If we structure from the get-go with positive outcomes in mind, then we can have a more robust discussion that really allows us to set ourselves up to provide an accurate pathway for the student so that we can identify what is necessary. So your MDT, your multidisciplinary team, should have more than 2 individuals, right? Easier said than done. But again, planning with that pie in the sky model in mind is absolutely necessary. Once you begin building your team, it goes above and beyond just having people at those chairs. If the information we bring into this multidisciplinary team approach isn't relevant, is outdated, isn't structured in a way that we can pull apart to build this robust student profile, then it doesn't matter that we have 6 individuals at the table. In order to have these meaningful conversations, we need some mechanisms of data collection. Sometimes we find that in our practice, there may be tons of data, but it's hard to know what to pick. The CUME file is a treasure trove of information, but can be overwhelming. We don't know what we don't know. What am I looking for? What am I looking for in the CUME file? We've linked this resource here because although we shared it earlier in our day 1 and day 2, it absolutely has a role in building your multidisciplinary team. Why is that? Because this gives you that structure that I just mentioned. It's downloadable, it's printable, it's fillable. So it truly is a tool that you can add to your toolkit to start collecting information about students so that we can have these meaningful conversations. I remember being part of an SST discussion and literally showing up with folders and spreading things out and trying to make sense of what I was going to share and not knowing exactly what was relevant. So this form can support teams in pulling those initial bits of information that can be found in the CUME file to then begin peeling back some layers. So Appendix 3.2 is linked into the slide deck, and I know that the slide deck for some reason or another is directing you to an older one, but we're going to fix that in the break so that you can have access to the new one. Yes, absolutely. So when we share out the slide deck updated link during the break, you'll be able to access all of the resources. Thank you for that, because then I can also let you know that everything that we're referencing today is directly linked in the slide deck. So as soon as we get to the correct link, you'll be able to access everything that we're referencing here. So this CUME file check, like many of the other resources, you can print, you can download, you can fill, you can save, so that it becomes your tool. All of these resources are available for you to download and also edit so that it can fit your school's needs. Or if you already have something comparable or better, absolutely share that with us also, because we love increasing our own toolkit as well. Another resource that will be helpful to the makeup of your multidisciplinary team is identifying extrinsic factors. Appendix 3.3 does just that for you. It gives you a structure for you to follow and begin collecting information that will help identify extrinsic factors. The reason we're talking about pre-referral within the realm of English learners with disabilities, dually identified students, is because we know that oftentimes some of our English learner students get referred for special education services when what we're looking at is a language difference, not necessarily a disability. Laying out potential extrinsic factors helps us have a more focused conversation that is based on existing information. What this form does for you is it gives you a way of collecting information related to physical and psychological factors, socioeconomical factors, family, academic, social, emotional, behavioral, so that when you're having a discussion around student needs, we're able to identify what truly is there and what isn't. Just based on the screenshot that you see here, you see section A, all about physical and psychological factors. The very few questions that you see there already start helping us frame how it is that we're going to have a conversation when we have this information at our fingertips. Does the student have access to healthcare? Well, who would need to be there for that multidisciplinary team to make that determination? Parent, guardian, school nurse perhaps, our head clerks that know everything. So again, this form could be used during the meeting or before. Are the students' basic nutritional needs being met? Who would have that information? And you begin seeing how this begs the question of who needs to be there, whether it be directly or indirectly by collecting feedback or having them be present. Do the results of hearing and vision checks reveal results within the normal limits? And if not, what are those next steps? Does the student have a history of ear infections, allergies, ear tubes? Might the student have an untreated medical condition causing pain? Dental cavities, exposure to chemicals, quality of water, etc. All of those have direct implications to how the student is performing academically, socially, and behaviorally. I'll tell you a story of a student that I worked with who was referred for special education, met all eligibility criteria for a processing deficit, so under SLD, auditory processing. Turns out years later that they found that he had stuck something in his ear. So it was so crammed in there that it was effectively plugging the ear. So not fully responsible for all of the learning issues that he was having, but definitely a contributing factor. So, like just bits of information to consider as you're having these conversations on the pre-referral process and then ongoing also. So after your multidisciplinary team meets, you review your CUME file data, extrinsic files data. If there is a structure at your school site where now you have an MTSS framework, where students are traveling between tiers of instruction and intervention, Tier 1, core, available to all, including English learners with disabilities, and then Tier 2, Tier 3 interventions. Which also begs the question, are there Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions in place, right? And are these available to all students? And is there a clear process? Does the written process match what we actually do? But this form helps you start thinking of how it is that we're documenting these interventions. And again, I'm going to reference a lot of examples from my experience that are by no means the only way things happen. I actually invite you in the chat to share with us, or you here in person to share with us what some of these processes look like at your sites, so that we can have, again, a meaningful discussion, our very own multidisciplinary team approach as to how we can begin looking at these structures and how it is that we collect information to make appropriate referrals, so that we can keep the student focus at the center. So the English Learner Intervention Summary, again, helps us collect some demographic data as you're building the student file within the context of your multidisciplinary team. And it allows you to collect monitoring, progress monitoring data. It allows you to document what comprehensive ELD looks like, integrated and designated, and potential write-ups or ideas as to whether the student's needs are related to a language difference or a disability. And usually there's the rub, right? We usually end up in a situation where we're like, you know what, we have all of this information, but we still don't know. We're still not clear, or I'm nervous making a final determination. Well, the I'm nervous is diminished slightly when it's a team discussing. Because if we have blind spots, then as a team, we can begin covering and uncovering those blind spots and having reflective conversations around this information. So if the team is documenting progress monitoring and data collection and making a determination whether the student's needs are related to a language difference or a disability, if an ELD TOSA is there, what's the ELD TOSA going to ask? Lupita, what would you ask?
I would inquire about what comprehensive ELD looks like, and how often it's happening, and whether or not it's aligned to the ELD standards, just for starters.
Okay, so me, Vanessa Lopez, special education teacher for 18 years in my prior district, I would not know to ask that. Not my wheelhouse. Not my pathway of trainings. Not invited to those. I only go to the SPED trainings. General education teacher, whose background is not ELD, wanting their student to get help because they're struggling. They're struggling. Potentially wouldn't know to ask that. What does ELD exchange look like for the student? Is it aligned to the ELD standards? Am I implementing a curriculum that says that it's aligned to the ELD standards, but I'm not really sure because I don't participate in those types of trainings? Lupita, question.
Just a question or an ask in the chat. Mm-hmm. If you could please repeat
Yes.
what you said.
Which one? Problems of people that talk too much.
I know.
What did I say?
Know. I wish I could give you more specifics. I think maybe just the whole coming together and, just kind of summarize basically what you've said up to this point. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so what I'm saying here is that when we come to this pre-referral conversation, this process, not one single person will be able to ask these questions and address these questions. If I'm the general education teacher making a referral because my student is struggling, if I don't have my ELD counterpart won't ask the question that Lupita asked. What does comprehensive ELD look like? Is it aligned to the ELD standards? Right? And even if I ask it as a special education teacher, because I know there's a section in the IEP that says designated ELD, integrated ELD, what if I don't know what that looks like? So again, I need my friend, my wonder twin, to ask those questions. We may have the best intentions through the pre-referral process to get students help, but if we don't have the individuals with the expertise at the table to ask those questions so we can engage in reflective conversations, know that you might not get all the answers, but at least you're getting that groupthink going where you can start looking at it from multiple angles. Because if Lupita asks me, the gen ed teacher that is referring my student because they're struggling with writing, well, Ms. Lopez, I'm wondering, what does ELD look like in your classroom? I'll say something like, I don't know. Like, I don't do the designated ELD. They do exchange for designated ELD. I keep the English only group. Who might be missing? The ELD teacher. Once that ELD teacher is there, then as a team we can ask like, hey, we were wondering, what does designated ELD look like for the student? He's an English learner and he's struggling with writing. Oh, you know what? Yeah, he's been a level 1 for 3 years now. And during ELD instruction, he really struggles with writing too. Oh, is your designated ELD class aligned to the ELD standards? Lupita would ask. Yeah, the curriculum says that it's aligned. How do we know? Right? So again, you start seeing how just having the conversation then maybe moves the focus away from just like this student is struggling, let's refer them to SPED, versus let's explore tiers of instruction and intervention and what they are mandated to receive. Title III supports, in this case, comprehensive ELD via designated ELD and integrated ELD. I'm not even talking about special ed now. We're talking about just the SST process for students that are struggling. And hopefully this really gives you some ammunition to request that we really keep in mind this multidisciplinary team approach by being able to provide some of these examples so that when you're sitting at an SST meeting, when it's just you and one more person, you have some questions that help depersonalize that conversation. I'm a big fan of depersonalizing tough conversations because those are never comfortable. And the last thing you want to do is be stuck in a situation where we're being cautious, tiptoeing around a very important conversation because we don't want to step on any toes, hurt any feelings. If we use a resource to have some of these conversations, it becomes a little bit easier to engage in that manner. Any questions in relation to this? So I'm curious, in the chat, let me know how many of you participate in pre-referral SST, MTSS framework conversations. And here in the room, just by show of hands, how many of you have been in a pre-referral SST? Okay, so. Here in the room in person, because I didn't see earlier when it was asked, how many of you are general education? Special education? So preaching to the choir today, basically, right? Okay, so. Okay, so the comment was that although the majority of our participants in person here today are from a special education background, this information is still helpful for them to share out with their admin when they are engaging in these conversations. And I think this is important because I remember thinking back, I'm thinking back to day one, and I think I shared this, that one of my biggest pet peeves was walking down the hallway and hearing like, oh, have I got a client for you? And it's like, really? Like, one individual's opinion about how the student is doing is enough to make the assumption that special education is necessary. And again, absolutely believe that that came from a place of like, this student is struggling. This is the one place I know that they can go to get help. But we're skipping a lot of steps. We're skipping a lot of steps. And there is a video that we share in some of our trainings where Dr. Alba Ortiz says the thing about special education is that once you get in, you seldom get out. Especially when we're talking about students who didn't need special education to begin with. Yes?
Clarified question in the chat. If you could please give an example of how to depersonalize a tough conversation. Maybe just revisit your point and offer an example.
Yes.
Please.
So let's say we are at an SST meeting, a pre-referral meeting, and we have questions. We have questions regarding what designated ELD instruction looks like. And the ELD teacher is there. Or the general education teacher is there, and the general education teacher is the person responsible for teaching comprehensive ELD, meaning both designated ELD, which is that set aside time where the ELD standards are the focal standards, and integrated ELD, which is when instruction is the product of tandem integration of the standards, content standards, and the ELD standards. So more like linguistic supports to access content. If I'm there as the SST coordinator, as a pre-referral coordinator, I might feel weird asking that ELD teacher, well, what does your teaching look like? Is it aligned to standards? How do you know? However, if we have a tool like this intervention summary, it's more likely that you can use it as a tool to engage in these conversations. All right, team, so we're here together to be able to collect some information related to instruction and intervention for, student X. So one of the questions that we're going to be asking today is, what does intervention data look like? What we're collecting, how often, what designated ELD looks like, what integrated ELD looks like, and also our thoughts on where we think the difficulty is. Is it more related to a learning disability or a language difference? So when we have this conversation, know that I'm going to be jotting down some notes so that we can build the student profile and share as much as you're comfortable and prepared to share in relation to some of the questions. So now you're having a conversation around this resource that is developed to collect meaningful information where it doesn't feel like I'm questioning you, what you're doing. And that also, of course, takes skill and nuance. Because if I still have this paper in front of me and I'm like, okay, you're gonna answer some questions and you're gonna tell me what it is that you do to make sure that this is happening in your classroom. Very different. Already I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like what, are we talking about helping the student or judging how I teach? Right? Yes. Yeah, so to restate that for our participants in Zoom, so the comment is yes, absolutely there at the team, but also think about maybe giving this form ahead of time so that as a practitioner, you're prepared with what's going to be asked and you're not taken off guard. You have a chance to fill it in, to think about what you're doing, because I absolutely agree with that. I think as teachers, we don't give ourselves credit because we don't know most of the time all the things we're doing, all the things we're doing. We differentiate from second to second. No, sit over here. Okay, what if we turn the paper around this way? Okay, you know what? Talk to him so you can do that. You know what? Let me highlight this a little bit more. Do you think you're going to need those picture cards? Let me sit you close to the bulletin board over here so you can see better. And that's what we're doing, right? So when you have, again, this structure to be able to collect this information, to organize your thoughts so that when you come into this conversation, that's already 2 points towards having this really meaningful conversation in a way that is non-threatening and depersonalized. Yes, there you go.
Okay, I was just saying that I think that that it's so key in terms of depersonalizing, and I've actually found that to be a really, really useful tool on my side in terms of collaboratively getting the feedback that's needed, because then they let down, other team members let down their guard. But the way that it is communicated, like, your feedback is so valuable to the progress, the educational progress and need of this student. And then even sending up a follow-up, thank you so much, I appreciate your feedback, and things of that sort, so that they feel, no one wants to feel hostile. You can put up that guard when it's like, oh my goodness, they're asking me for this. Are they, observing what I'm doing? Do they think I'm not doing my job? Anybody, we all do it. And so what it helps as, like, for me, both a special education teacher, but just an IEP case manager, having to get all those pieces of information and then put them into one document, it's more effective and efficient when you have something like this, but also the way that you communicate, the way that you ask, the way that you think, the way that you help them understand that they're just a pivotal piece and key part in the child's education, helps them feel like, okay, I'm doing something. It's not them just asking, but they need this information because I'm a valuable asset to this team.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, because I have to say that approach is critical. Words matter. Like, as trite as that sounds, like, words really do matter. Approach really does matter. Relationships do matter. And I really appreciate you mentioning how if we preface this with your feedback is very important and not just dropping this form in their mailbox, right? Or walking in between, hey, I'm gonna need you to fill this out, right? It doesn't give it the importance it merits. And another thing that I want to point out in regards to this form is that, and again, as a tip, would be that if we're having this conversation and you've done all of the above, right? You've given the form ahead of time. You've explained what it is that the form is for. You thank them for their collaboration and participation in getting the student what they need, et cetera. And we come to a point where it's like, you know what? Like, I thought I was doing what I needed to do for designated ELD. Like, but like, I guess I'm not. What happens in that situation when someone becomes available and vulnerable? Like, what do we do? So are we prepared to offer, you know what? Thank you for sharing that, because that lets me know as a PD coordinator that I need to get something together, or I have something that already exists that I need to invite you to. Again, multidisciplinary team that goes above and beyond just the needs of the student, because the team needs to build up as well. Do we have the resources available so that when we come to a hiccup in this process, to help individuals feel prepared? It does not feel good when you're in a situation when you're like, you know what, I don't know that. And when you're in a situation where you feel like you can't ask for support, that makes it even worse, because you want to get better, but you don't know where to go. You don't know what to ask. So again, important for all of the little cogs in our system, in our multidisciplinary team, to be well aware of the process. So we've had really rich conversation up until now. A lot of information was presented to you. I need to get you the right link for the resources. So we're going to break. We're going to break for, Lupita, what do you think? 7 to 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Perfect. Okay, we're going to break for 10 minutes. We'll be back at 9:41, and I will get you the correct link out there. Thank you for your engagement. See you in a bit. As we're making our way back to our seat or in front of our screen, if you're joining us at home or in your classroom or in your office, I want to let you know that we did update the slide deck, the link, and the QR code. I went back a couple of slides just to share the new code, and again, definitely let us know if it's not working. You will be prompted to make a copy, and the reason we do that is not because we don't trust you with our template. It's not that. It's so that it can live in perpetuity in your Google Drive, and then you can do any edits, any revisions, any changes to it so that you can pull the information that you need, so that is available there for you. If you're joining us on Zoom, Lupita will continue to drop it in the chat. Please, 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 feel free to share it out. If you think there's somebody in your team or in your site that would benefit from receiving these resources, absolutely do that. We provide all of our resources for the low, low price of $3.99. So make sure to share those out. So now I'm going to go back to where we left off. And to recap some great feedback that we received in the chat, and then also from our in-person participants here. We were engaging during the break, and we absolutely got to talk about some really important points related to how some of these processes can work and cannot work. So if we go back here to Appendix 3.4, which was our intervention summary form, we were talking about depersonalizing difficult conversations. And I wanted to make clear that all of these conversations don't necessarily need to happen also within the context of the SST or the pre-referral. Could be in conversation also. We were talking about how some of this intervention summary information could also be related to behavioral concerns, right? We know that this time of year is challenging. Everyone's had it. Everyone's done. Everyone's reached their threshold, and behavior is at the top. Most every conversation is around behavior. Can you believe so-and-so did this? I can't do any teaching because I'm constantly putting down behavior. So what we were talking about was that this previous form, the multidisciplinary team approach form, was a means of providing us with a depersonalized conversation, right? And we were talking about how when we're considering student needs, we're talking about all students. We're talking about general education students, English learner students with disabilities, all of them, right? So when we're collecting data and information to make recommendations for tiers of intervention and support, it's inclusive of not just academics, but social emotional needs and behavioral needs as well. Because as we're collecting data and having these discussions within the multidisciplinary team, we are focusing on analyzing data, analyzing the intervention, and making adjustments to interventions and or to refer for further assessment. So here the multidisciplinary team is key because this process on the surface looks incredibly cumbersome for just one individual. So if I am responsible for the data-based intentional teaching and that I'm providing culturally and linguistically responsive and relevant instruction, if I don't have somebody to help me identify what those tools are or what that instruction might look like, I can't make the determination of yay or nay. Analyzing the intervention. What does fidelity mean? Is it when I get a chance? Is it Monday through Friday? Is it that I'm following the program to a T? What is it? Are we differentiating and using asset building? So to give you some example there, when I was in the classroom, I was teaching a class, an intervention class. I was doing one block of Read 180 and System 44. And that was separate from me being case manager and a special education teacher. So even though System 44 was largely computer-based, there was that teacher-led instruction element also. And although we had the books, the teacher guide, everything, I had to still differentiate for some of my students. So being well aware of how we are even doctoring up those interventions is important. Another thing is that in me implementing the program with fidelity, I needed a level of coaching. If I was just given the material and not enough coaching, I can't say that I was in fact implementing it with fidelity or not. So who's involved in making those determinations? Who coordinates that PD, that curriculum adoption? What is happening there? Again, that multidisciplinary team. That approach exists not just in the pre-referral process, but also from the administrative lens, from the professional learning lens, from the special education lens, when we're talking about SARB, when we're talking about different elements like that, we want to have as many individuals present that can contribute to the conversation. Because if we are making adjustments to interventions or referring for further assessments on the basis of one person's lens, the process will be lopsided and incomplete. If I am making adjustments to my intervention without considering the English learner needs, because we know that there are multiple English learner typologies, then we're going to have an issue. I like using the following example. A student who's an LPAC level 1, and the student is having a hard time composing multi-paragraph compositions, failing ELA. And that's all I have on the surface. What does that level 1 mean? Okay, let me pull back some of the layers. Ooh, he's not a long-term English learner, he's a newcomer. He came in last school year. Ooh, last year for SST when he first came in, they gave him speech to text. Ooh, the teacher says that he doesn't like that he refuses to use it. However, how much are we digging? When I call in the student and I say as the SST coordinator, you know what, I was reviewing because the student is a part of that multidisciplinary team too. I was looking at your learner profile, like it says here that you don't like using speech to text, why not? Oh, like I don't like it. Okay, can we try it? And then as you're sitting there and you're listening, because a student is a newcomer, he is reading a lot of the items phonetically and trying to pronounce words that phonemically he's just not there. So then that tool isn't really a tool. It becomes more of a barrier. And it's not about refusal. It's not about him not liking the tool, not wanting supports. It's that tool was just not appropriate. However, I wouldn't know that had I not asked the student directly. Had I not asked my EL specialist, oh, I see that he's an LPAC 1. Like, how many years has he been in LPAC 1? Oh no, this is his first year. He got in here in May of last year. Oh, okay, that makes a difference. I wouldn't know that if I didn't have that conversation with that additional member. So again, progress monitoring also should be encompassing of that multidisciplinary team so that we can provide the appropriate supports and make those tweaks and adjustments to instruction for our students. Which takes us to this frequently asked questions. And we've linked this question along with many others related to the MTSS process and response to intervention in that little post-it link right there. But here's the question. Is there a recommended or required amount of time that an English learner must be in the MTSS or RTI before making a referral for special education? Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no, sideways for not sure. Yes, there's a recommended or required amount of time for an English learner to be in the MTSS or RTI process. Or no, there is no recommended time. Or you know what, I don't know. Or as we love to say in SPED, it depends. Or I have a fear of commitment. What is it? So we have a bit of a mix here. What about the chat mix? So I want to tell you first and foremost that this is a brave space, guys. We are here learning together. I'm not here to impart all sorts of information. I'm here to learn from you. We're here to build our collective expertise. We're here to be our own MDT. Notice how I'm setting it up so we can have hard conversations that are depersonalized. So the answer is no and yes. Yay, SPED. We love our gray area. Though it is best practice or recommended for English learners to receive high quality, evidence-based interventions over a 4 to 6 month period, that's just a little span of time to provide enough time to determine if the student is struggling academically. There is no set time, okay? Best practice, ideally, you want to provide English learners 4 to 6 months of an intervention that is targeted to be able to make that determination. It is best to start progress monitoring after 4 weeks. Tons of variables there, though. What is the intervention? What is the identified area of need, and do they jive? Okay. If my student is struggling with reading, guess what? Reading has tons of elements. Is it because of language? Are they missing some vocabulary? Is it a fluency issue? Is it a reading comprehension issue? What truly is the area that the student is struggling with? And is it a match? If the student is struggling because of a language need, they can decode perfectly. They just don't have the language to make sense of what's being decoded. That's not a disability issue. Okay? So we want to ensure that we have enough time to provide a targeted intervention with fidelity in order to make that determination. However, there exists this thing called child find. Okay? And that is a huge responsibility. Once anybody in the MDT team suspects a disability, ideally, you would assess. However, if the student is an English learner and we're not sure, it is our responsibility to dig before we make that determination, which is why the multidisciplinary team is so important. I want to remind you also that being an English learner is not a disability. There are 13 distinct disability categories, and English learner is not one. So if we can't rule out being an English learner, that's an exclusionary factor. We have all been in situations where we see a sense of urgency, where we know on our experience that there's a disability present, right? And we want to make sure that students get the help they need. And I say that because sometimes what we may be tempted to do is like, oh, yeah, there's definitely a disability present, so we're gonna wait until the IEP comes into play to provide them supports. So we're going to wait for those 60 days and not do anything until they get special education support? No, they are entitled to Tier 1 instruction, first best instruction, Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. If we're making those referrals without having any information documented, we're not doing right by students. Multidisciplinary team is critical, especially in these situations. I'm in this situation where I have an English learner and we're providing them interventions and we don't see much progress. Who do I need to bring to this next meeting prior to making that referral? That ELD teacher, that ELD specialist, and that special educator. Because they can shed some light as to what could be happening. And why not your reading specialist? Because if the struggle is with reading comprehension, guess what? Our reading specialists, our academic coaches, are also full of ideas, tools, and resources that we might be able to try out in the classroom setting, and also if there's outside support related to the tiers of instruction and intervention, so that we can actually address the student needs. So going back to day one, we talked about Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 prior to referral for special education. Guess what? You may not see it there, but the MDT is here. The MDT is in this section. Before we go from Tier 1 to Tier 2, we're having conversations. Before moving from Tier 2 to Tier 3, we're having conversations. When the student is doing better after receiving Tier 3 and we're considering Tier 2, the multidisciplinary team discussion is there as well. Notice how there are 3 distinct tiers prior to a referral for special education. And having those conversations is critical within the context of the pre-referral process with the support of your multidisciplinary team. So we've linked these resources in here again so that now you can look at them with the MDT lens and think about what those conversations could look like and how we can layer some of the forms that we shared with you earlier, like the extrinsic factors, the CUME file check, the intervention summary, to make an appropriate referral. And here come family involvement in our MDT. Because guess what? They are a critical part of the multidisciplinary team process. We know that sometimes referrals for SST may come from the classroom teachers, but sometimes it's from parents. I see my child is not making progress. What are we going to do to support them? Is there an intervention? How can they get some support? How can they get tutoring? Families are critical in the process, especially when we're talking about students that already have an IEP and a 504 plan. They're always important, but they are critical when we're talking about the main principles of IDEA. We know that in order to weave the thread of educational benefit, we need to ensure that we have access through FAPE, appropriate evaluations, IEP development, parent and student participation, access to the least restrictive environment, and the procedural safeguards. That's how we're able to weave that thread. And we want to ensure that as part of our multidisciplinary team, we're not just striving for compliance, that we're actually having meaningful participation. Parents are critical It is one of the most important relationships that we should cultivate in the IEP process. A breakdown in communication can make or break the IEP process for the student. And there are a couple of things that we can do to ensure that we are fostering meaningful participation. Number one, those procedural safeguards. If we follow those procedural safeguards, chances are you're good. If the parent's home language is one other than English, we must provide translated documents. Even if the parent says during the meeting, oh, I can just use a translator during the meeting, but then at the end says, you know what, I'd like them in Spanish, or you know what, I'd like them in whatever the home language may be, we must provide them if they request them. If the parent requires an interpreter, again, also our responsibility. Why? Because we want to make it clear that we care enough about their participation that we want them to make informed requests, that they engage appropriately, and that they feel valued as a team member. If we're having a discussion that does not include the parent, that is already letting the parent know quite clearly, your input is not important. We're making the decisions. Critical part of the multidisciplinary team. Sometimes we know that we inherit difficult relationships where perhaps in the past parents have felt unheard, unimportant, and Figure 5.1 provides some strategies for us to really ensure that we're having active and meaningful parent-guardian participation within our multidisciplinary team. So taking it back to the prior slides when we were talking about the appendices to collect information, you saw extrinsic factors. Parents are a rich source of information for extrinsic factors. Death in the family that was not reported to the school. Family history of ear infections. My husband lost his job. We're in between homes right now. Many different things that unless we have the parents participating, we are unaware. We have family living with us, and Johnny had to move out of his room so that his aunt and his cousins can stay there. He no longer has access to a quiet place to do homework. We won't know that unless parents are communicating that with us. And with that in mind, Figure 4.8, not 5.2, is the parent report for the IEP development. So this form has some structured questions so that you can ask them of parents as you're building this student profile for the IEP. So we're SACE users here in Imperial County. Some of you out there might be Welligent users or Cyrus users. But on our present levels page, we have a section about parent concerns and student strengths. And this form gives you a way to collect relevant information that you can use to not only fill out those sections of the IEP, but to also give you contexts to why the student may be performing in a particular way and give you additional information to feed what that baseline might look like. Okay, what does that mean, Vanessa? Well, question one, what are your hopes and dreams for your child? Important to know that. Important to know that. So many times I would get lost in the process of having an IEP meeting because that was my job, right? I had to develop that IEP, I had to connect with my peers at the school site, I had to develop these goals and objectives that were linguistically appropriate if they were English learners, you know, do this, do this, do this, do this, do that, compliance, right? That was my job. For parents, this is their child. This is the most precious person in the world for them. And it is important for us to know and take that perspective from one of our critical multidisciplinary team members. And one of the ways that we can do that is through this form. Mom, Dad, tell us what your dreams are for your child. And you might hear something that you've never heard before, good or bad. But now you had a means of asking that question in a depersonalized manner. To be completed in person, if the parent wants to complete it in person, to be sent in the mail, to be sent electronically, to do it over the phone as an interview, on a Zoom, on a Google Meet, however works best of where you are in that relationship with that parent. What are your child's strengths and interests at school? What are your child's strengths and interests at home? What are their favorite subjects? How does the child learn best? From the parent's perspective. Because in the classroom, we might see something completely different, and you might see some consistency in some of the areas, but you then might receive incredibly important information for you to tag on to your teaching. So for example, one of my students in the past was absolutely obsessed with Magnum PI. I don't know who introduced him to Magnum PI. I'm thinking his grandmother, because his mom was too young for that. I remember Magnum PI because my mom was in love with Tom Selleck. And, sorry mom, and she would watch Magnum PI all the time. And this child loved Magnum PI too. So when the parent wrote that this child, like his interest, likes watching Magnum PI, I was like, okay, that gave me insight to build a relationship with that child that I didn't have before. And I would have never imagined. And here I was, racking my brain, trying to connect it to the like cartoon characters that were popular. I was going to miss the mark every single time because he did not care about Yo Gabba Gabba. He did not care about any of that. He was all about Magnum PI. So mom gave me awesome information. So now I was able to do little cutouts of Tom Selleck as Magnum PI and put him around his stuff to get him motivated to do work. So wouldn't have known that. I didn't have that form at that time, but I thought ahead enough to ask those questions. Like, what does your son like? And I asked it in that way, like, Mom, what does your son like? Because I've tried Broby, Fufa, like Tootie, like all these different, and nothing. She's like, oh, and she started laughing. Well, he loves Magnum PI. I was like, because of course, I would have never guessed that, right? So anyhow, great way to get that information because now your teaching can embed little bits of that, right? And another hilarious one for me was, what's your child's favorite subjects? When I would get back that their favorite was the one that they were doing the worst in, right? And that would make me stop and think like, okay, so maybe it's not the subject, maybe it's the way I'm teaching it. Like maybe they love math, but like the way I have him do it is just not for him. So again, great information for us to take in and consider. Because all of that is going to help us navigate through this process more effectively. As we're looking at the referral and decision-making process, you'll notice that there's like a lot of stop, check, go back, no, don't go, no, stay put, yes, keep going. There's a lot of these steps here that are not the role of one person. You really need a multidisciplinary team approach to be able to navigate through this decision-making process. Pre-referral is inclusive not just of collecting CUME file data, not just about identifying extrinsic factors, not just about the intervention summary, but of the teams that make up all of those steps and the conversations around it. so that we can fruitfully move through it in a seamless way that brings all of this together. So with that in mind, because I know that was a lot, we're going to provide you some time to explore a structure that brings it all together visually. Because we don't want this to just stay here with you. We want you to be able to take it with you, share it out in a way that is meaningful, in a way that is actionable, and the way we propose you do that with your school-based teams is through the pre-referral flowchart infographic that our team has created to make available to you. And Lupita is going to walk you through all of those elements. Lupita?
Thank you, Vanessa. So I'm going to come up here because one of the things I want to do is pop it open so that you can see the different ways that you can not only access it, but also use it. Vanessa says the team designed, but really she was instrumental, as well as Dr. Deborah Montoya in creating this amazing resource for you. So the pre-referral flowchart is a way to organize and or help create or restructure a system for your pre-referral process. So I'm going to invite you to think about your current pre-referral process, your role in the pre-referral process, and tap into your background knowledge, your experiences while engaging in the pre-referral process. And we understand that there are different entry points and that you may be coming in and out of it, depending on the student, depending on the context, etc. Many factors, right? So the pre-referral flow chart is a way to help, number one, sequence the process and connect you to some potential useful resources to help give this process some structure, some intentionality with your dually identified students in mind. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to pop it open and Vanessa's gonna drop it in the chat, which I'm pretty sure she has already, for you to be able to access it. So I'm gonna walk you through the organization of it so that when you dive into wherever you wanna dive into, you have a feel for how it's organized. So the pre-referral flow chart, again, by design is a resource that can be used with your multidisciplinary team and or individually as a member of the multidisciplinary team to help inform your respective role in the team. But again, it's designed to be utilized to help guide the conversation and the decision making and the accessibility of resources that the particular student we're referring to may need at the moment. So the first way that you can access it is through its entirety. It's organized into 4 different pages so that you can access the pages individually when you download them. You can download them in blocks and do a deep dive of each of the individual blocks. So we're going to start up at the top, and forgive me, I don't mean to give you vertigo by moving up this infographic. So you can see here that there are 4 key elements, or 4 stops, if you will. So as you are navigating through each one of the elements of the pre-referral flow chart, you have not only some context, but you also have some resources to help inform that context. So Vanessa walked you through a process, a 4-step process. So that process is how we've organized this infographic. So for example, your first stop in your first phase of engaging with this infographic is to take a deep dive of the CUME file. What information do we already have currently of the student? And then you can see how a resource is connected to that context to help you take that deep dive and collect and organize the information and also identify what might be missing. Another section, another context for this phase is to, through that deep dive, is identify what, if any, extrinsic factors, food insecurity, trauma in the family, a health issue, social-emotional issues that we know research indicates have impact on academics and academic progress. What might already be happening in the student's life that may be impacting his or her progress or lack thereof. So it's another kind of stopping point. And then here we go into that third element. Again, I see it more kind of as a zooming in on the student's, I don't want to say lifestyle, what am I looking for? On the student's characteristics and maybe what and how those behaviors are manifesting and what might they be linked to. So what might be some social-emotional factors, psychological factors, and again, information and resources to help you collect and organize that information. So before you move on to the next phase, we take a little pause here. And again, this can be used with a team or individually, depending on where you are in the pre-referral process phase. So if the team, or if you who are thinking about referring the student, after taking into consideration these three pieces, if you determine that the student's lack of progress is due to physical health or mental factors, and that those are potentially, very likely, based on the evidence that you've gathered, a primary contributor to the student's challenges, then we put a pause on that special education assessment referral. And the next step is, and this is where the multidisciplinary team approach plays a critical role. If we determine that the student is experiencing some trauma in the family as a result of food insecurity, then connecting the student to appropriate resources to address that need that is impacting what's happening in school. So it's not about, okay, no need for SPED assessment, let's move on. It's no, let's find out what it is, what potentially it could be, and connect the student to those appropriate resources. We may have them within the school or within the district. We may not. And if not, then we reach out to the community, right? So that is our role, and that's how we tap into and how we utilize this multidisciplinary team approach. Maybe it's connecting them to a food bank and the school psychologist or counselor. Maybe it's both, right? But the pause here is we've identified a potential root cause for what's happening in the students, that's impacting the students' academic progress. And as a team, we're looking for and or identifying and more importantly, connecting the student to the appropriate resources and services that are going to help address what is happening and impacting the student's progress. So I just wanted to walk you through how each one of these phases is organized and want to ask you to, as we're going to give you some time to explore it, and you decide which one of, there's 4 phases, you decide which one of those stops you want to spend some time on. Perhaps you are in the middle of a pre-referral process right now. Perhaps you're thinking about referring a student. Just pick what seems to be more relevant to you and start there. Or you could start from the top and just work your way down. So let me go back to our slide deck. So again, as stated earlier, there are 4 phases or 4 contexts to consider. Extrinsic factors is kind of what I walked you through to give you a demo or a model of how to explore the flow chart. Another key consideration are personal and cultural factors. And again, you're going to find some resources that are directly linked to each one of these contexts. So again, to help organize and create or enhance our current system, language development, because of course we're talking about dually identified students, and then finally the learning environments. So I'm going to ask you, we're going to put about 10 minutes on the clock, which I think is sufficient time to give you time to explore the pre-referral flowchart in its entirety and or dive deep into one of these components. So I see 10:32 on my clock on my end. Let's come back at 10:42-ish and we can do a quick debrief As you are exploring, let me give you a purpose for engaging. As you are exploring the pre-referral flow chart, bring with you a specific context so that you are looking at it through the lens of applicability. So maybe it's a student, maybe it's, you are in the middle of an SST and you're part of that SST, and, think about the conversation that's been going on. So that's your context. Bring your current experience to the exploration of the pre-referral flow chart. We're going to put 10 minutes on the clock. When we come back, we're going to invite you to share out your insights and then maybe some questions that may arise as a result of your exploration. So with that, it's 10:33 now, so we'll be back by 10:45. We will have started the debriefing process. 10 minutes can be a really short time or a really long time. Hopefully it was at least enough time to help you become familiar with this resource. We're very grateful to the opportunity to share it with you because it gives us an opportunity to receive some insight and some feedback. So on that note, I want to be able to open it up to those of you that are joining us here in person as well as in the Zoom to share your insights from your 10-minute exploration of this resource. So there's a mic near you, grab it, give us some feedback, give us your thoughts, what was going on in your mind or in your discussion as you were exploring this resource. And same in the Zoom. Vanessa will flag me if there's something that we want to share out loud. Thank you.
Can you hear me? There we go. So I think this is a great resource. I feel 100% it's important to do that in-depth CUME review of the child. One case in particular that was popping up in my mind was a student that I had who was an English learner, and she was being referred for special education. But in bringing simply the attendance in and all those things, it was noted that she was missing like 2 to 3 days almost every week. And so the team was able to say, well, we need to see an improvement in this before we determine if, it's really the fact that she has a learning need or the fact that she's not here in school, so she's not able to access what's needed for the ELD component, her English language development. So that kind of just confirms certain things that I've seen and that were done in certain meetings in terms of the importance of doing that CUME review, that child find with collaborating with other members and getting their input to ensure that we are looking at all factors before we make a determination if that's in terms of the direction in which we need to proceed. So, and sure enough, when we kind of were able to communicate and collaborate with parent more and let the parent know, and actually the evaluation for special education was coming from the parent, but we needed her to be here at school more to see if it's actually her language development that's impeding on her learning, or the fact that she's not here, so we can't see progress. So in that, the parent was more, we were on the parent more, the parent was more collaborative in making sure that she was there, and we did see improvement in terms of her language development and in the areas, like in terms of reading and stuff that the teachers would say that she was struggling in.
Right, so thank you for sharing that example of a real life situation, right? So taking that deep dive, and you don't even have to go that deep, right, when it comes to things like attendance. But if you're not the teacher who is making the referral, in this case, the parent is, there may be some information that you're missing. In the issue of attendance, absolutely. Not being in class, not having the opportunity to engage, learn content, develop skills, acquire your language acquisition in a cohesive, consistent way, it's going to have an impact. It's going to show, right? You will see gaps in content and in skills. So again, just focusing on what is the issue, what is the root cause, and connecting it to this is what might potentially be having an impact on the student's progress. And more importantly, folks, is connecting the need to a resource. And so in the case of attendance, I don't want to presume that, that maybe let's just for the sake of an example, maybe it was an issue of transportation. Who knows, right? Let's say that it was. What role might the school have in making addressing the attendance issue, and how might transportation be something that the school can afford? It may or may not be something that the school can do, but you have a potential opportunity to solve this issue so that the student does not suffer the consequences of something that clearly might be out of the family's control. Okay, how about from the Zoom? Let's see if there's any insights or comments or questions. Not yet? Okay, let's bring it back to our folks here.
There's a couple of points here about how usually we go straight to learning environments, not necessarily considering 1, 2, and 3, extrinsic factors, personal and cultural factors, language development, and just going into the learning environment. And also not remembering that we're looking at the whole child, right? Just keeping that, yes, the sum of the parts, but also the whole. What does that look like? And then one of the bits of feedback that was given here is that if there's a reason why the EL observation protocol doesn't include the ELD standards, I was about to respond in there, but I'm going to use this opportunity to talk about how that protocol is not about lesson alignment or evaluation. It's more about how the student is functioning in that class, because again, the conversation is more around how the student is performing, though we do recognize, as we mentioned earlier, that knowing what those ELD standards are and what that lesson looks like can be held and should be absolutely held, those discussions and trainings, but that observation protocol is more about the learner and his environment and how it is that they're accessing. It is, though, important for us to call out the fact that we don't spend enough time talking about those ELD standards, and not just talking about them, but really taking a look at what they are and what they aren't, because I still feel there are multiple myths out there about those ELD standards, and I really want to highlight how much I appreciate that comment about requesting the ELD standards included in the lesson plan, because that, and not the lesson plan, the observation protocol, because that tells me that we are thinking about them. And that is more than we've seen in the past. So it gives me hope that we're in the right trajectory.
Right, thank you for sharing the comment, our friends on the Zoom, and Vanessa for following up with your insights. So I'm gonna bring it back to our folks here in person, because it kind of sounded like that we had somebody else who wanted to share. Go for it. Brave space. We can tag team it perfectly fine. Vanessa and I do it all the time.
I think the first one that I looked at was a language development, just because I've been recently getting a lot of EL referrals, and I really like the use of the student questionnaire, because a lot of times we don't get deep into the student, like when do you use the English language in school, at home, when is it most easiest. I really like the questionnaire that you guys included for the student to get to know them, because a lot of times I'll ask the teacher, oh, would you hear them, well, in class they speak mostly English, but like outside in the playground, most of the times the teachers can't observe what the student is using, who they're using the language with, a peer. Most of the time they'll be with an aide, because usually the aide is dual language, and they feel most comfortable. Sometimes they feel uncomfortable with their peers because they might get made fun of or something like that. So I really like this questionnaire.
Okay, thank you. And your colleague over there wants to tag team with you.
No, I was just going to say that I really like the flow chart and how that it has all the hyperlinks embedded into it as well. Most of the students that I have are already identified, and so a lot of times I'm looking into why haven't they moved up or out of why are they still requiring so much support? And so I kind of deep dive and look at, everything. And so sometimes it's a lot to look at. And having this kind of organize it a lot nicer. I also like the bottom too, how you have the different tiers and the SPED assessment, the comprehensive ELD at the very bottom too.
Thank you. Thank you for your feedback. Again, the purpose of this flow chart is to help organize some of the resources that we are connecting you with and collecting, and in collecting data to paint a comprehensive picture of how well the student is performing, where are the areas of need, and perhaps why those areas of need are happening, because all of that affects progress. And if those areas of need are not academic, what types of resources and supports might we consider and implement prior to fast forwarding to a special education assessment? So my experience, again, is a general education background, EL specialist lens when it comes to the pre-referral for English learners. And given the data that currently exists on how the percentage of English learners who have an IEP, it makes me wonder, and again, those top 3 qualifying categories, it makes me wonder of how much of is that the qualifying factors, were they truly due to a disability and or the fact that the students were still progressing linguistically and may or may not have had the appropriate linguistic supports that they needed, through comprehensive ELD. So it just makes me wonder, again, that's my lens, that's what I bring to the table as a member of the multidisciplinary team. I feel that it's a valid question that merits, gathering some information on. Thank you for taking note that the student is also a member of the multidisciplinary team, which is why it's really important to gather information from the student, that student interview. What are your favorite things to do? When do you use English? Why, is it easy for you? Is it hard for you? I mean, those questions are designed to gather authentic information from the student's perspective, and that is critical information to help, again, paint that big picture, the comprehensive picture of the student, so that we can align the appropriate resources. So anything else regarding this flow chart? Let's pass the mic back here.
Yeah, I agree with the ladies that just shared. And I hadn't seen the student questionnaire, so that was a really an eye-opener. But I really enjoyed looking at the learning environment, because going in at admin enters a classroom, and that focused observation appendices for while English instruction is happening, what are the students doing? I think that's really important. Also the visual supports. Are there visual supports? Are there sentence frames? Are there things that will help all the children in any setting, but specifically in a SPED environment. So I really appreciate that link to that, and I really was hoping this flow chart would be visible whenever we come to meet at PLCs or for SST meetings. Just a reminder: are we looking at, like you mentioned, the whole child, and not just the learning environment, not just the extrinsic factors, but everything. So I really appreciate the work that you put into this, and having a visual. I think when we come together as educators, it makes a huge difference.
Right. Thank you for that. Again, to quote my friend Vanessa, the resources that we share with you and all of the hyperdocs or hyperlinks that are connected to it are resources to help gather information and to guide conversation, so that a well-informed decision of next steps, connecting the kids to the proper resources based on where they are today, is the whole goal, the whole purpose, to depersonalize. Well, why isn't ELD happening? Teacher, why isn't ELD happening? Maybe it's, I haven't had training. I'm a special education teacher, and I'm never invited to the ELD trainings. It'll shine some light to current practices that are barriers for growth, even for including the adults, right? Those of us charged to provide rich learning environments. So we feel confident that a resource like this one will help depersonalize conversation and get a team through a difficult conversation by not pointing fingers like, oh, you're not doing this, or the child's not progressing because this isn't happening, and more of, what does the evidence say? Where is there evidence, where isn't there some evidence of what we are claiming, right? So again, we appreciate you using it. We appreciate you giving us some feedback. Again, we are also of the continuous improvement mindset, and if it serves you well, then we feel encouraged to continue to create resources such as these. If you see maybe something that, you know what, and this situation is good, but maybe we can add this. So again, feel free to reach out to us and let us know how these resources are working. So I'm going to call attention to the bottom part of this infographic because these are really important reminders. The pre-referral process is not the path to an IEP. And as a general education teacher, who when I was in the classroom, that kind of was the mindset. And again, this was a long, long time ago. And I'm hopeful that things have changed where I worked in the past. And I'm pretty sure they have. The SST, the purpose of the SST is to do exactly what the pre-referral flowchart is guiding us to do, is to gather information about the student, connect this, identify what the problem is, where is the root cause, is it attendance, and then addressing it. How might we as a team better connect the student to the resources and services that he or she needs? Needs glasses, maybe needs their hearing checked. Maybe we need to connect them to community services, to help them find proper housing, food bank, etc. So that the student is better equipped, more comfortable, more focused, feels safe to be able to engage fully in school and with his or her peers in the classroom, prior to determining that this is an issue that requires special education. It may or may not, right? And it may down the line be what the student actually needs, but that does not mean that the other factors, like extrinsic factors, don't play a role. So it's literally connecting the dots. So the bottom part of the pre-referral flow chart reminds us of the role of Tier 1 instruction. Vanessa reminded us earlier today that being an English learner is not a disability category. Comprehensive ELD is Tier 1 core instruction for all English learners, including our English learners with an IEP. They don't get a separate thing that may or may not look like or sound like or feel like ELD. They have the right to receive comprehensive ELD in the form of designated and integrated as part of their core instruction, not an intervention, as part of their core instruction. And special education assessment, and I'm going to read it directly from the slide, this is the reminder: the normal process of English language development as well as manifestations of dialect and social linguistic variance shall not be diagnosed as a disabling condition. So the language that the assessment is being implemented in to access information about the student's areas of strength and weakness is critical. Right? We want to make sure that we are assessing in the student's language, primary language, to be able to, again, paint that comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do. Because we know it to be true that if a disability exists, it's going to manifest in any language, right? So we want to make sure that, again, thinking about those top 3 qualifying categories in which English learners are qualifying for special education, that kind of bottom, that through line is language. We want to make sure that it's not an issue of language acquisition, that it truly is a disability, and therefore that disability would manifest in both the student's primary language as well as in English. So again, just key things to remember as we are moving through the pre-referral process and connecting kiddos to the appropriate services and supports. So additional resources that we want to call out and point out and make accessible to you. Again, we spent some time with the pre-referral flowchart. One of the smaller images there is a note-taking guide. If you click on the image, it'll take you directly to that resource. That note-taking guide contains all those links that you see on this slide in a way that is designed to be able to engage as a team and further explore these resources together as a team for the purpose of building some common language and some common understanding. Think of it as a community of practice PLC opportunity for your multidisciplinary team. And again, who do we invite to be the multidisciplinary team? Anybody and everybody, right? Depending on the student situation. Your general education teachers, your EL support staff, your school psychologists, your speech pathologists, your administrators, everybody will benefit from becoming familiar with these resources, because at any given point, you may be called in to participate in an SST. You may be the teacher or the support staff that is considering making a referral for a student. And so it's important for, as a team, as a staff, to be familiar with these resources and how to engage in a systematic way for referring kiddos, and more importantly, how to connect them to the appropriate resources that they need. So again, we want to leave this here for you so that you have an additional resource to build the capacity of staff as you move forward in creating and enhancing your pre-referral processes. And one more resource, and this one, absolutely, I'm going to give all the credit where it needs to go, and that's my amazing colleague, Vanessa. She created an infographic for each one of the chapters of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. Chapter 3 is what we see here. Chapter 3 focuses on pretty much everything that we've been talking about up to this point. And so by accessing this infographic, you'll have I call it kind of a Reader's Digest version of Chapter 3, but it will take you directly to the grounding resource itself, should you need to explore further or want to read up a little bit more. But we want to make sure that we give you access to all of the resources within the Practitioner's Guide and companion resources that were created to help better access this very hefty but very important and very well developed and designed resource. So we want to make sure to call it out and let you know that it's there for you. And I'm looking at the clock. Is it about time for a little break before we move into the next activity? What do you think? Okay, so let's do a 10-minute brain break. Brain breaks are important. They also give us some time to grab a snack, right? Okay, so as we're rounding out this section of our day together, the pre-referral process, considerations for the multidisciplinary team, we're going to give you some time to further explore an additional resource. Now, this resource is designed to contextualize the pre-referral process through a student scenario. You see this slide, we have 4 student scenarios. We're going to be kind of diving into a couple of them more intentionally. Right now, we're going to take a closer look at the student scenario found in Chapter 3. And this is where we introduce our little cruz, our little crucita. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to invite everybody, Zoom friends, live in-person friends, to come together as best as you can as a team. So here in person, I'm going to ask you to kind of group together in groups of 3 or 4, your preference. And if you're joining us via Zoom, and if you just happen to be joining with a partner or a friend, you know, this is an opportunity to collaborate. If you are joining us individually, you're going to collaborate with yourself. But know that the design of this resource, this activity, is so that you can replicate it. right? Again, the goal here is to build the capacity of a multidisciplinary team. And we want you to engage in it and be thinking about how might you be able to roll this out, to whom and when and how. So in order to do that, we want you to become familiar with it first. So if you click on the student scenario meet cruise, and I'm gonna have to come up here to show you, you're going to see a student scenario pop open. And organized, you have a prompt here, and organized by chunk, right? You see that they're numbered. So we designed it for you to engage in it jigsaw style, but you don't have to. We just wanted to give it some structure so that you can engage with it in the best way that works for you. So we're going to ask you for the next 20 minutes to take a closer look at the student scenario with the pre-referral process in mind and consider these questions. How well are these areas, the areas that are numbered, considered prior to referral for special education eligibility? And then the other question, is who might be missing in the process? So the first question is about the student scenario. The second question is about your current practice and processes. I hope that makes sense. So when we ask about who might be missing, I want you to think about your current pre-referral process, taking the student scenario, which is an exemplar, in mind. So we're going to put 20 minutes on the clock. I'm going to ask you to regroup here in the in-person group, in the in-person training. Just, lean in on each other, maybe pick one or two of the elements or divvy them up, and then come together to respond to these questions, the two questions on the slide. So we're going to put 20 minutes on the clock. We'll walk around here to make sure that if you need any additional support or directions, we're here to support you. Same for those of you joining us via Zoom. So we're going to spend some time getting to know Cruz and her journey through the pre-referral process. We'll come back at 11:40 to debrief, and then we will break for lunch. See you back in 20. The gift of time, right? The gift of time. So again, folks, thank you for taking the time to dive into the student scenario with that background knowledge of the pre-referral flow chart and the conversations and reflective questions that you had prior to engaging with the student scenario. So as you can see, the way that we designed the student scenario is so that groups of people, teams, can engage in and have conversations around these 6 elements through the lens of the pre-referral process. So it can serve 2 purposes. Number 1, to build the capacity of a team or teams. And number 2, to offer opportunities to reflect on current practices and policies and see where we might have places to enhance or to build or revamp. Just it really is about continuous improvement. So I want to offer you a little bit of time to debrief. Let us know what conclusions you came to, what was your thought process, and if you feel compelled to address the questions that we put up on this slide, feel free to do so. So I'm going to start with our folks here in front of me, and then Vanessa will make sure to address and call out whatever comments or questions come up in the Zoom. So I would like to open it up for you guys, and if you have a mic nearby, please use it. So I think it looks like you guys made 3, you had 3 teams, right? So we'll do just a quick debrief of your respective dialogue.
Okay, so in our discussion, we talked about who might be missing in this process, and we discussed like a reading coach or somebody to do a reading specialist to intervene.
Definitely. I agree. Well, and just because the sections were well, The sections were really covered for the students, the case. I just felt like, well, since the area was the phonics and the decoding and spelling, maybe the reading specialist could have provided some insight or background that the core teacher, might have not shared, or it seemed pretty much that the things they had tried for intervention had been done diligently. We just thought, well, maybe that person. Did they talk about an ELD specialist? I think they did have an ELD specialist, so that was covered, yeah.
Oh, it's on. Okay, so to answer the first question, how well are these areas considered prior to the referral for special education eligibility? We thought that they're relatively well. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but for the most part, I mean, they gave the general areas to kind of note and to keep in mind in terms of referring. And then who might be missing? We also said maybe an academic coach of some sort, specifically probably in reading, to focus on. And then even the student input, even though the student is only in second grade, there's still some probably valuable information that they can share. And I know even at that age, they talk so much that they're starting to know about themselves and what works for them. So maybe like that student survey, and the teacher can just fill it out as the student's orally telling them in whatever language they're comfortable with. And then, yeah, I think that answered those questions. I think that's it. Yeah, and then we just straight up got into like, yeah, they probably, or no, they probably don't, based off of the data. But I think the section that shed a lot of light was the differences between language acquisition and disability. So there was like some good information there to kind of say like, well, yeah, this should be a candidate probably for referral, just because of some of the things that were brought up, like when you read to them, they're able to comprehend it, the text if it's read to them. So that shows like they understand the English language, because we're assuming that that's read to them in English. And then they don't have any difficulties in the math concepts, or that's one of their skill areas. And then in terms of the letter substitution, it was saying how they're substituting, but it's not related directly to their primary language. So it can also be an indicator that, well, it has nothing to do with them mixing the languages, because there's no correlation. And then they're able to isolate the sounds, but it's when they're blending the sounds that's a problem. So we just kind of put our SPED caps on, and we're like already kind of going through it.
I'm like, no, SPED is the last resource. What strategy? Color blending.
Yeah.
Like things like that. That's why she said I was overly positive.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we were talking about.
Right. So I appreciate you contributing to with your background knowledge in mind when diving into the different elements, the information that we have on Cruz. Because again, these are exemplars, but by no means are they designed to be like, it has to be this way, right? Because every child is unique. Every scenario will take in, it's like a window of time, right? So this is what Cruz is presenting today, right? And, has been for a little bit, and that's why we're having this conversation. But does it necessarily mean that we're leading towards a full-on IEP? Perhaps, maybe not. As we move forward, as you begin to implement the supports and strategies that are identified up to this point, we may see some progress. And it may be that, we are implementing tier 2 support, maybe tier 3, at some point. But those are cyclical and they're short-lived, right? They're not supposed to be supports that are implemented until the kiddo graduates. They really are designed to be progress monitored and modified and changed and updated as the student progresses and develops skills and concepts. So I appreciate you bringing your insight and your expertise to the scenario. It enriches it. We have one last group over here that we want to give the mic to, and then we'll open it up to our friends in Zoom land.
As far as the areas considered, I kind of just had more questions in regards to the English language development area. Just felt like maybe we could look more into that. on top of like what the other girls have already said. Totally agree. We kind of discussed all that as well. But also kind of wondering, has anyone looked into dyslexia or dysgraphia or anything like that? Being the fact that she's able to, listen to the story, recount it, sequence events and things like that. If that is, maybe it might have been more presented in the English language development area, and it doesn't really give too much information in there. Like I still have some questions in regards, I would be asking, are word cards provided? It doesn't really give me like what strategies or tools were used in the classroom for the student. So I'd have more questions for the teacher to ask. And then who might be missing in the process? We kind of said if there was, depending on the level of the child, because, I don't know for this school, but certain schools have, ELD specialists or, English language teachers that would be able to maybe provide some more insight or ask the right questions and bring some more information to the table to kind of help identify where that need is or where's the support, could be added or something.
Right, so drilling down a little bit more and perhaps making some recommendations for strategies that have not been captured, at least in this scenario.
Yeah.
Right, so again, back to our tiers of support, right? So the pre-referral process is not a pathway for an IEP. It really is for the team to come together, gather information, problem solve, identify what the potential problem or problems are that are causing the gaps in progress, and addressing them, whether they are within the school or outside of the school.
Yes, to
right?
kind of make sure everything has been
Yeah, we're making sure that we're
first.
exhausted, right? All the resources are exhausted and connected. And again, some schools have different types of roles. You have ELTOSAs or specialists, academic support coaches, social emotional support staff. So making use of all the resources that are made available to the student inside and outside of the school, within the school and outside in the community, is the ultimate goal, right? So we can't mess it up if we are connecting those dots, right? And if they don't exist, then what does exist? And maybe it prompts us to create a resource. We don't have social emotional staff. Maybe we write a grant and secure some staff, or we partner with another district organization and collaborate in making sure that our students are receiving this type of support, because we're seeing a trend, right? We're seeing a trend, and more kids need this type of support. So again, thank you for sharing your insight and debriefing how this resource broaden your perspective of how to approach the pre-referral process. Vanessa, do we have anything that we want to share from Zoom?
Yeah, we have some really good feedback here.
Okay.
We have some related to maybe looking at different modalities for learning. And I think that's important because typically that is something that lives within the realm of our early childhood education teachers. Like for some of our students that might be showing some delays in some areas, and they have amazing resources, activities, tools that might be helpful. Consulting with an occupational therapy professional also doesn't necessarily mean that they need to meet eligibility criteria to receive those services, but just consulting with them like, hey, what are some things I could do for a child who's having some difficulty with X, Y, or Z that's related to some of those needs. Some sensory needs as well were brought up, incorporating some technology also. If there's an instructional technology specialist on board that we could consult with. So again, considering all of the individuals that could potentially contribute to this process is critical. So a lot of really good feedback along that vein here in the chat.
Thank you, everybody, for engaging in the student scenario and for offering your insights and feedback. So we're going to break for lunch. When we come back from lunch, we're going to reflect a little bit up to this point through the lens of the multidisciplinary team. I'm looking at the clock. let's reconvene by 1 p.m. It gives you just a couple of extra minutes to get in and out of the car or to take care of some other multitask business in Zoom land. So see you back at 1 p.m. Drive safely, enjoy some lunch, give yourself some break. Thank you.
All right, everybody, welcome. Hopefully you had ample time to enjoy a meal, answer some emails, take care of a couple of things, or not. But we are happy that you are back, and we're going to spend this afternoon continuing with our team lift approach lens, especially building after that team time that we had looking at Cruz's scenario. Even if you were not participating as a group, as an individual, we highly recommend that you go through that student scenario and consider some of the following questions. Who makes up your MDT locally? Who might be missing, and what are next steps to building your MDT if that is what your team is going to engage in regards to conversations that set at the center the participation of the multidisciplinary team in multiple systems that exist in our school day. So let's jump into now to the referral process. So remember, this is the wheel of referral, not to say that these are steps that you follow to get a child to be found eligible for special education, but more the steps that we typically go through in identifying, in connecting, in discussing, in reflecting to see if that referral may in fact be appropriate. Once that referral is made and the multidisciplinary team has ample time to come together and discuss, to monitor interventions and the data, then we might decide as a team that a referral is appropriate. When that referral is determined to be appropriate, we draft up our assessment plan, the assessment process begins, and then we complete the IEP, whether the student is found eligible or not in any of the 13 distinct disability categories, all within that 60-day timeline. So because many of our participants here today in person and via Zoom have a special education background, this might be an easy question, but it may not, because we're learning that sometimes a lot of the things that we take as being status quo are not necessarily codified anywhere. It's just a way of having done things over time. So here's this question. Is it true that schools or SSTs must wait until a student has been receiving EL services, Title III services, for 4 to 6 years, or they are at least in 5th grade so that they can fully develop English language skills before being referred for special education? Thumbs up, thumbs down, sideways. Participants in Zoom, let me know. Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no, and sideways for me not know. Survey says no. Good job, everyone. Disability occur in primary language. Whether or not they receive ELD in across all contexts is required, yes, so that we may rule out that it is not in fact a language different, but actually an indicator of a disability. However, that points out the importance of us having skilled assessors and bilingual assessments so that we can make appropriate determinations. If a disability exists in English, it will exist in Vietnamese. It will exist in Cantonese. It will exist in Spanish. So it is important for us to be able to articulate that, not only through the use of bilingual assessments, but bilingual assessors as well that are proficient in how nuanced language can be. We know that when we are assessing, because as we shared earlier, for a lot of our students, once they receive access to special education services and supports, especially in situations where special education is seen as a place and not a service, it's very hard to get out. Again, that systems lens, right? How we've established our special education services has a lot to do with how it is that students are able to access the service, or if it's seen as a location where you're sent off to, and that's where you shall remain. Assessment critical to this process. We want to yield accurate information as to what the child can do, not just academically, but developmentally and functionally. And the way we do that for students whose home language is one other than English is to assess in the primary language. That is a loaded statement, I know that, for a variety of reasons. Number one, for us locally here in the Imperial County, it may be easier. Why? Because the majority of our English learners are Spanish speakers and we have assessment tools in Spanish. However, we know that in more diverse regions of the state, where we can have 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 different languages and dialects, that presents a more challenging situation. On top of that, even if we did have a bilingual assessor in the child's home language, perhaps an assessment battery does not exist in that dialect, in that language. So that presents some challenges. To navigate that very much nuanced conversation, we have an infographic for it. We have this infographic on culturally and linguistically appropriate assessment. Sometimes the term gets thrown around, it gets bandied about quite liberally, right? Like, oh, we want to ensure that things are culturally and linguistically appropriate, but what does that mean? This infographic really does a great job, though I'm biased, at having teams consider how it is that assessment processes can be culturally and linguistically appropriate. I do want to caution us, though, in that if we don't meet all elements, that also obligates us for next steps, right? What can we do to address some of these different areas? So we're going to go through the 5 checkpoints of this infographic. Number 1, data gathering. So thinking back to the pre-referral process earlier when we shared some of the appendices, you're going to have access to these tools that have been helping you collect information from pre-referral now to the actual assessment process. You have rich data that is multifaceted and that is contributing to building that robust student profile that will allow us to see what the student can do. You want to collect assessment reports, which can be the psych assessment reports, speech or language assessment reports, whatever it is that we are assessing to determine need and eligibility, we're going to take a look at that information. So that's step 1, data gathering. Cume file check, extrinsic factors, intervention summaries, all of that is relevant too. And then we're going to examine required elements. If you'd like, you can pop open this infographic and follow along as I walk you through it so that you can read some of the text and aren't forcing your eyesight to be able to see all of these little details. So every section has a series of checkpoints. When you're examining required elements, you want to ensure that the assessments you are selecting and administering are not discriminatory on a racial or cultural bias, that they're used for purposes for which the assessment measures are valid and reliable, administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel, and in accordance with any instructions provided by the producer of the assessment. So those are basic steps that most of us that participate in the assessment process, whether it be as the academic assessment person, as I was, as case manager and special education teacher, you want to make sure that all of these elements are happening. The other thing that we have to have in the back of our mind is that although the assessments that we're administering, we're ensuring that we're sticking to the script so that they may remain reliable and observable and all of these issues,
we want to make sure that we keep into consideration the student's home language. Yes, question? Oh, okay. So Lupita, if you could drop the link in the chat and maybe update it in the slide deck so that it works, because it's not working. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. So we want to ensure that these elements are included in our consideration of the assessment process. Why? Because when we are reviewing results, we want to also reference the fact that the student is an English learner, where they are in their English language proficiency, and start making those comparisons if we do in fact have access to an assessment that is available in the home language. We have the parent questionnaire, the teacher questionnaire, and the English learner extrinsic factors data collection sheet here too, because they're also providing relevant information that we can utilize in the interpretation of the assessment results. Not to be reported exactly as assessment result data, but in the interpretation, as you're summarizing, as you're connecting with parents and teachers to let them know exactly where it is that some areas of performance may be impacted by primary language acquisition issues. We also have the observation checklist for the classroom. Focused observation during English instruction, what that looks like. And then the parent feedback for the IEP development. I want to point out that Appendix 4.6 and 4.7, though they may sound similar on the surface, it's really important for us to see the difference. So 4.6 is all about the English learner classroom observation. It's more about the environment, what's going on in the classroom, not necessarily the instruction, but more the classroom environment, what's happening. Is there a schedule visible? Why would that be important? Linguistic support, right, for them to know, to be aware, to be connecting. Does a student feel safe taking a risk, producing that new language? Are there models of student work displayed? Are there high expectations present? Are we presuming competence? Are the visuals relevant? Are they engaging? So again, that is more about the classroom environment, right? Think back to the pre-referral environmental factors. The classroom environment, academic environment, totally would fit in there. When we're looking at 4.7, we're talking more about how it is, what it is that the teacher is doing. Meaningful, purposeful, behavioral observations from the student. How is the student interpreting information? What are some of the patterns that stand out to us? So again, all of this is important as we begin to collect all of this assessment data, couple it with this observational data to get a better idea of where it is that the student is. And if you notice, this doesn't have to be done by just one individual in the group. It could be where one teacher is responsible for the English learner classroom observation checklist, the case manager, I mean, if you're going in to make that observation, the school psychologist, any other member of your multidisciplinary team. It could be that you determine roles, who's going to be doing what, or maybe there's two individuals because sometimes one pair of eyes don't pick up other things that are happening. I'll give you a quick example that's more related to behavior. I had a student who was in the referral process, and the suspected area of need was more related on the surface immediately to me with my experience to executive functioning and impulse control. So very much seemed to indicate the presence of ADHD. So I did see some behaviors like that, but then I was also aware of some of the classroom environment factors that weren't necessarily supportive of the student remaining engaged. So one of them was the following. It was reported often that the student would smack kids that would pass by his desk. And not like hard to punch them, but like just like get out of my space, right? When I went into the classroom, the first thing I noticed is that he was sat by the pencil sharpener. So two things came up for me. They could be invading his personal space as they're walking by his desk. They could be rubbing up against it. They could be moving his things, or they could be hitting him too when the teacher couldn't see, and then they would just see him sling out. One thing. The other thing, auditory input. It's just so annoying to be hearing the sharpener going and going and going and going that I just get frustrated and I act out. First graders, by the way. One thing. The other thing is that not only was he by the pencil sharpener, but I'm talking about like maybe 10 years ago where we still had the projectors, but he was by the projector blowing that hot air. So he was always putting his head down, complaining that he had a headache. So that turned into he's not focused, he doesn't do his work, he makes up excuses not to work, he's hitting his peers, right? So here we are in the process already of the referral. That assessment plan is signed, so I can't say like, oh no, it's because of we're already in it, right? However, that's going to be important information for me to collect and share out so that when we have these discussions, whether or not he meets eligibility criteria, right, that these are some of the things that we want to watch out for. So great information for you to bring into the context of the multidisciplinary team as we are drafting either the IEP if they meet eligibility or just some supports for the classroom if he doesn't. And I didn't say if they meet eligibility criteria for the IEP or the 504 if they don't, because the 504 is not a consolation prize. Okay? The 504 is not a consolation prize. There's also a process for that, and we need to discuss it. And that involves a multidisciplinary team approach as well. You don't need a 504 to tell you to move a student from the sharpener, because it's annoying him. You don't need a 504 to tell you that it's okay that the student turns in their work a day late. You don't need an IEP or a 504 to reduce from 20 math problems to only 10. You don't need a 504 or an IEP for that. It's at your discretion. So again, important things for us to consider. So when we are looking at the assessment battery, again, as I mentioned here locally for us, it's relatively simple. When I would assess a student who was an English learner, regardless if they had been here for 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, I would still assess in Spanish if they were a Spanish speaker at home. Why? Because I want to have a point of comparison. So the first best option is to administer cross-cultural, non-discriminatory assessments. You want to engage in structured interviews. We shared some tools with you already, some observations, and we want to collect also curricular-based assessment data and criterion-based assessment measures also. So not just one. We want to stay away from just one source of data. However, we know that sometimes that's not possible. What we wanted to do, though, is provide you with Appendix 4.1, which gives you a list of potential bilingual assessment tools. And they're organized by test name and publisher, age and grade span, and a description of it. So there's quite a few of them. So that is there available for you to review and maybe share out with your multidisciplinary team focused around assessment, right? Your assessment teams. We know that sometimes that won't be appropriate for a variety of reasons. I talked about already that
maybe the language, the home language that the student speaks, there is no assessment battery for that language. So we have some other options. Second best option is to use a trained interpreter, administer the primary language assessments under the supervision of a licensed assessor, and document the limitations of that assessment. That's the second best option. The third option is to use an interpreter who speaks the primary language to provide an oral translation of the assessments normed and written in English. We have to remember that we cannot report these as standardized test scores, so you want to make a note of that in the assessment report. But we do want to document the patterns of strength and weakness in relation to the primary language and then the English language assessment. And then finally, the fourth option, which is typically what we see, is assess in English, including nonverbal areas of cognition. If the student shows low cognition, or there are patterns of weakness, try to validate that with non-standardized data. Again, those same observational forms that we saw earlier, the ones for the classroom observations, the one for what the student is doing in the classroom. Those are different methods of collecting non-standardized data to support or to supplement what some of those patterns of weakness or strength could be. What's important, though, is not to be quick to move from this to the fourth option. Doing our very best, it's a moral imperative, really, to try to go from the first best option, second, third, fourth. However, we're cognizant of the fact that there perhaps won't be a batería in Mandarin, right? So being cognizant of what's available, what isn't, and some of the additional options that we have for assessment are important. And even here in the realm of assessment, specifically bilingual assessment, the MDT approach comes to play. When you are working with an interpreter, it's all about coming together, discussing, preparing. You want to make sure that they're familiar with what tests are going to be administered. We want them to be aware that the assessment may take extra time, that they are in fact speaking the same dialect, right? Because sometimes it's happened also a couple of times where it'll be something like, oh yeah, the student came from Central America, so the assumption is Spanish. And then once you get there, it's a dialect, right? So just being well aware of that. Or there may be Spanish that is spoken, but Spanish is not the home language, it's the second language, right? The dialect is the first, Spanish is the second language, and then English is the language that they're learning. So just being well aware of those elements. And to be sure that we're only administering the tests that the interpreter has been trained in administering, and also to debrief with the interpreter. Because as the interpreter is assessing, they may be noticing some patterns in the student's home language that you perhaps might not if you don't speak that language, right? So it's important to come together and debrief to, again, get an accurate representation of what the student could do, right? That is critical. Accurate information of what the child knows and can do academically, developmentally, and functionally, right? So what we mean when we say non-discriminatory is clear. So we've bulleted out some of the most important points here. The instrument, number one, must be valid and evaluate the specific areas of need, not just general intelligence, okay? It must reflect aptitude, not sensory limitations. Same example as a child with the sharpener and the projector. If he's not focused on what is being assessed, making sure that it's not related to some of the environmental, sensory issues that might be impacting how it is that they connect with the assessment.
cannot be related to limited school experiences. Again, extrinsic factors. I think somebody earlier was mentioning attendance. The child was referred for services or assessment, but the team couldn't rule out that it wasn't related to lack of access, right? Limited schooling or interrupted schooling. We cannot delay the process while waiting for another diagnosis. And that happens more with our littles, right? Where it's like, oh no, they're a client of regional center, so we're gonna wait until we get the results from that assessment. We want to ensure that we're proactive and not delay waiting on any other assessment results or evaluations from an outside individual. And we must also include information that is related to enabling the student to be involved and to make progress in the general curriculum so that they can have access to their non-disabled peers and participate in appropriate activities. So earlier we touched upon also how it is important that we connect with families, with parents specifically. Because now in the IEP process, if it was important before to have parents be a critical role of our multidisciplinary team, in the IEP process, it is the cornerstone of a functional IEP, right? Because if the parent doesn't agree with that IEP, they don't have to sign, we don't implement. Or they only sign for the parts that they agree on. So we want to ensure that the assessment plan as well as the assessment results are in a language that is easily understood by the general public, in the primary language of the parent or their preferred mode of communication, where the assessments and the results are explained, and letting them know that the IEP cannot be implemented without their consent. And as we're getting closer and closer to our transition to UPK, right, where our littles are going to be coming into our school sites pretty soon. Pretty soon we're going to be having a lot of little ones at our school sites. That presents additional considerations for the multidisciplinary team, where a member that we haven't talked about earlier is not going to come into play, an early childhood expert. Somebody that knows about the developmental milestones and what language looks like for dual language learners and children who are learning multiple languages. So we want to be sure that we are collecting the appropriate information and that we are making a determination if the student is in fact an English learner. Because the same way that we do it for our older kiddos that take the LPAC is not the same for the little ones. They don't take the LPAC until they're in TK, right, Lupita? In TK. So if they're coming in from the preschool setting, we still need to engage with the parents. We still need to engage with some resources to make a determination as to what that home language is. If you want an expert to say it, and I always say if the expert said it better, be quiet, let the expert say it. There's no bigger expert on evaluation of culturally and linguistically diverse populations than Dr. Sam Ortiz. Dr. Sam Ortiz presented here at ICOE a couple of years back, and it is outstanding. We've linked the presentation there if you want to share it out with your assessment teams. He goes into depth, posing studies, resources, references, etc., on non-discriminatory assessment and the framework for all practitioners. So that is available there with the resources. So if you have your school psychs, school psychologists, academic assessors, SPED directors that you want to share this information with, know that that whole training package is available for you there. A great activity for your assessment multidisciplinary teams is this. This self-assessment allows teams to go through their process. You can do it individually or you can do it as a team. If you are at the point where you're building relationships still with your assessment multidisciplinary team, maybe have it be something that you do individually first and then come together to discuss your results, or as I love to do, hypothetical results, right? Say that I didn't do this, right? What could I do instead? And then just go through the process to have very rich discussions related to comprehensive assessment reports for English learners, because really the end result is this, right? When you're looking at your redacted report, whether it be your own individually or as a team, were all of the elements addressed? If yes, that is fantastic. But consider the following. Is that just you, or is that every assessor in your team? If yes, then how can you share your knowledge and expertise to support other assessors that maybe perhaps did not meet all of those areas? And if not, what might be some of the obstacles that you're experiencing? Remember, we don't want to pretend that everything that I have when I don't. Who do we ask? Who to reach out to? Who do we lean on? And how might we ensure that moving forward, the assessments may be conducted to ensure culturally and linguistic practices are in place? It's a process, guys. It's a process. So start thinking of it in that regard also. And how do you lean on that multidisciplinary team to build your collective expertise? Because I hope if we've highlighted something today is that it's about the team. It's about building the group. To help you go a little bit deeper into the assessment process of English learners as students with a potential disability, we've included Chapter 4 infographics here in this slide, and then also you can find it on our website. And what it does is it takes you directly into areas related to assessment from the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. Because a lot of the resources that we referenced for the MTSS framework and the referral process now in assessment, you'll be a little bit more familiar with the situation that Cruz now finds herself in with her multidisciplinary team. What we want to do now is we want to give you a couple of minutes to pop open Chapter 4 student scenario, but our darling friend Cruz here, and see what the multidisciplinary team approach looks like in relation to assessment for potential identification as a child with a disability. So I'm going to give you a couple of things to do. And you can go back to your team huddles for those of you that were here live in person. And for our friends in Zoom, I want to give you the following indications. When you pop open the student scenario, consider the following areas: the assessment plan, language of assessment, areas of suspected disability, interviews, observations, and preparing for the IEP. You can go in order and do all 6. Or you can start with one that you're most interested in. Because time is limited, I know that you might only get to 1 or 2 areas to really look at them in depth. Because what's important is to consider the following. What was considered? What did they bring in? What was said? And who might still be missing in the process? The assessment plan. Was it in a language that the parent could easily understand? Language of assessment, was consideration given to her primary language? Were they clear in the areas of suspected disability? Interviews, who was interviewed? How did those go? Observations, what did those show us? And how is it that that multidisciplinary team came together to prepare for the IEP? So I'm going to go ahead and set 15 minutes on the clock. Okay, sounds good. So we are going to set 15 minutes on the timer. You can start coming together with your teams, those of you that were here in person. Those of you that are joining us in Zoom, pop it open, and we will see you back in 15 minutes. All right. Hopefully those 15 minutes gave you ample time
to take a look at Cruz's scenario. And I want to give us a chance to debrief what we found, what we thought was done well, what we thought was lacking, what was a highlight of the multidisciplinary team approach, or questions that arose. I know it's after lunch. Let's get it going. Come on, juice is flowing. What did we find? Yes? Here you go.
They figured out that she was thinking cognitively in Spanish, and that was kind of one of the key elements that they needed to kind of get down to figure out where else to go. And that was just kind of, I think, a big pivotal point for their investigation.
Perfect, perfect. Great point. Anything else? Live friends here. I'm coming. I'm coming. Anything? Perfect. Thank you.
So I thought it was for the most part, very well put together. They got a lot of insight and input from each team member. And then even in the beginning, it said that they weren't sure which language to test her in, but then they realized that Spanish was the way to go. And then even they got student input, which was great as well. So I thought that a lot of the components that were there it really provided a plethora of information and insight into where she's at so that they can make that ultimate decision in terms of if she qualifies or not for special education.
Perfect, perfect, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So the team, again, engaged in these conversations, brought in the experts. In this case, what better expert than the student, right? To let you know how it is that they're accessing information. And what's interesting is that for Cruz, this process really brought the team together to be able to consider what it is that she truly needed. Had we not addressed the fact that she was still processing in her primary language, that would have been a missed opportunity. It reminds me of a situation where I had a survey, and I surveyed 4th, 5th, and 6th grade students at my previous school about different questions, just trying to find out about students. And a lot of it was very lighthearted. But one of the last questions, I had just finished reading the book, Things I Wish My Teacher Knew. And I asked that question. It was an open-ended question at the end. It was on a Google form, and I was collecting student responses on a Google Sheets. And we had 2 newcomer classrooms at the school site where I was at. And over again, the theme with a lot of our students who are in the newcomers program was, what I wish my teachers knew, that I'm not dumb because I don't speak English. And that was heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. And my friend Lupita has a saying that says, you know, like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. In this case, once I read it, I couldn't unread it. And I was like, okay, I have to do something for these students. I have to do something for these students. So one of the ways that I was trying to show up for them was by having them included in more school-based activities where they perhaps were not feeling, where was it at? We had a section that talked about feeling welcomed. And I wanted them to feel welcome. So having those school-based activities where, yes, absolutely, they are open for everyone, including you. Let me help you be part of this. Because a lot of times they felt like they couldn't participate. So just as my role was to like give them an in, even though they were never excluded outwardly, they just didn't feel comfortable. Like they belonged, like they understood. So little things like that, again, began building that sense of community. However, had I not reached out through this survey, I wouldn't have known that. And there, the student was part of my multidisciplinary team to know about the culture of the school
and those subcultures within the overarching culture of the school. Very critical information to go through. So again, that team lift, all hands on deck. Who's a member of your MDT for the assessment process? Who might be missing? What are your next steps? Hopefully the time we spent exploring some of these resources were helpful for you to see how you could support the development of your multidisciplinary team. And if you don't have one yet, that is okay. Who to reach out to? Might our next steps be? And to take us back now to dive in, but also to zoom out in the overarching system, I'm going to hand it over to Lupita so she can walk us through systems improvement with an equity and access lens for dually identified students, specifically the role of the multidisciplinary team. However, because I want us to start anew, bright and refreshed, we're going to take a 10-minute break so that we can come ready to close it up and head on home as soon as we return in 10 minutes. So at 2:07, see you back at 2:07.
We're rounding out our day together, and we have one additional resource that we actually haven't pushed out a whole lot, but I think we intentionally placed it at the end of our session today because it really hones in this notion of continuous improvement and the systems lens to our respective work. I often catch myself saying things like, we all contribute to the system. And I truly believe that. I truly believe that whether things are going the way we like them to go or not, we're contributing to that existing system. And meaning that we have control, right, of how we contribute or not into what is producing. So whether you're a classroom teacher, your sphere of influence is your delivery, the training that you receive, that you request, how you implement it to meet the needs of your students. That is completely within your sphere of influence, right, and within your control. Knowing what your students need, accessing that information through how you implement instruction and how you progress monitor. If you're an administrator, your sphere of influence is providing appropriate training and support for your staff, within the parameters of, what your restrictions are or not. Your role as a leader is to ensure that your staff is receiving the training that they need based on the student demographic. I think more often than not, we hear that students are not accessing content, not because of skill so much, but because of behavior. They're, manifesting their feelings, emotions, whether it's related to academics or not, we don't know. So if that's what we're seeing, if that's becoming a trend at your site, then where is the training following? Is the training following? Because, we know that like in any profession, in order to do better, we need to get better, right? And we need to address the needs that we see in front of us. So we all contribute to the existing system, and good, bad, or ugly. So this resource that we're going to share with you as we close off our day today is a resource that we share through the lens of systems improvement. Any system, your classroom, your department, your site, your district, your program. So it is designed for multidisciplinary teams and for the individuals within the multidisciplinary teams to improve overall outcomes within the classroom, the school site, the district, the program, right? So we're gonna spend some time becoming familiar with this final resource for the purpose of really taking a step back to all those the smaller systems that we explored today. The pre-referral process, which is a system in and of itself, the assessment implementation, and data gathering, which is an assessment in and of itself. This resource is big picture, right? Big picture, but also relative to your scope of work. So we're going to spend some time exploring it. And again, it's a resource to be shared out, to be implemented. As you become familiar with it, think about who might you want to get this, whose hands you might want to get this to, and how might you be able to utilize it within your scope of work. So again, our focus is dually identified students. And by design, this resource helps us take a look at English learner needs, student with disability needs, and our dually identified students, because English learners are a group, right? And some of which may need additional supports or services in the form of special education. And then we have students with disabilities, right, who maybe they are in a language program, like a dual language program. We have a few here in Imperial County. And so they may also be needing some additional linguistic supports. And then we have our dually identified students, our English learners who qualify or are eligible for special education services. And so, again, we want to be able to tease out the characteristics and the needs of the individual student. And then when they intersect, like dually identified students, then we want to be able to hone in on that intersection and provide those specific supports. So this part of the infographic, I'm gonna put my glasses on. This part of the infographic has these 4 components. Again, it's designed to be organized in such a way to help us kind of tease back the different components of the system. So I'm gonna just run through, I'm gonna go to this part first and then work my way backwards. So I'm gonna ask you to take a moment to just explore these 4 components of the infographic. And as you become familiar with them, I want you to jot down for yourself individually, what are some of the pieces of information that you need? Whether it's data, whether it's information from another department or another person, your administrator, a colleague, a school psychologist. I want you to look at the infographic through the lens of where you are and where might you be able to reach out to make a connection. So let me just put 5 minutes on the clock just for you to become familiar with this resource. Vanessa can drop the link into the chat box, and those little icons are going to be the areas in the infographic that I'm going to ask you to just spend a little bit of time on becoming familiar, and then we'll come back. So this part of the infographic is a deep dive into your current policies and practices. Oftentimes we ask the question, what are your current practices? Are they written or unwritten? Because sometimes what's in policy is not necessarily what is being practiced. And sometimes what's practiced is vice versa, not what's in policy. And it just becomes the system, right? So this part of the infographic is a broad overview of what is in policy. You know, how do we know that? As we circle back to our district's policies, and what is actually happening. So, for example, we find ourselves having conversations around the reclassification of English learners with disabilities, the processes and practices, what is required and what is happening don't always match. And so reviewing your current policy, what is this policy? What's written? And is it inclusive of our students with disabilities? What is practice? How are we engaging in the pre-referral process? How are we engaging in utilizing assessments and implementation of best practices for assessments for English learners who are struggling, and also for students with disabilities? So again, this is a deeper dive into what's written and what's in practice to help us really discern where in the system is the glitch and how might we collectively start moving towards addressing those glitches. I'm pausing to see if you might have any questions or thoughts. You know, maybe you have been part of a committee, you know, input on policy, or maybe input on current practices, or developing a handbook of sorts. What are your thoughts around this section of the infographic as it pertains to a review of policy versus practice? What comes to mind? And can you grab the mic? It's right there. Thank you so much.
Mine was mainly about reclassification of the students with disabilities. Who decides those factors? Because like what we have at our school is really difficult for our kids to achieve. And so I feel like they're stuck in that hamster wheel forever because they have disabilities, and then they're stuck in that LPAC testing every year, and it's just overwhelming. And so who sets that criteria?
So just to put it in the context of what we're talking about now, and to address your question, the reclassification criteria for all English learners, including English learners with disability, is set forth by the Department of Education. And it's based off of federal regulations, Title III federal regulations. California has taken those federal regulations and designed recommendations and requirements for reclassification. And it's requirements / recommendations because there are four elements, four criteria that the Department of Education sets forth. The first criteria is overall 4 on the LPAC, or an overall 3 on the alternate LPAC for those English learners with disabilities who are eligible for the alternate LPAC. So that's the requirement, right? The remaining 3 criteria, because there's 4 prongs to this criteria, are locally determined. They're recommended. The recommendation is teacher evaluation and input, parent consultation, and then an assessment of basic skills. That's the 4th criteria, the assessment of basic skills. So it's appropriate, the consideration for students with disabilities, and this is where, going back to policy, you know, what does the policy say? And are we inclusive of students with disabilities? And I'm glad Vanessa walked in because she has a really good example of this. We're talking about criteria for reclassification in the context of what's in policy and what's in practice. So criteria 4 is an assessment of basic skills. So when we're talking about a student with a disability, right, an English learner who has a disability, and we're using criteria 4, which is locally determined, right, meaning your district determines what assessment that is, or assessments those are. What's critical to take into consideration is that you're comparing with another student who also has a similar disability. Otherwise, it's not fair. Not 2 different criteria, same criteria, different assessments. And I'm going to hand it over to my partner.
So the approach there is more about an inclusive practice from the very beginning, right? And again, one of those other terms that gets thrown around, but let me explain what that might look like. So for criteria 4, we're looking at an assessment of basic skills, right? And that is locally determined. And when we start looking at reclassification criteria locally, statewide, all over the place actually, to be honest, we see that there has been little consideration for our students with disabilities who are English learners. So instead of having a separate way that again accentuates exclusion versus inclusion, is by writing it up from the very beginning to be inclusive of all students. So where part of the criteria says something along the lines of, for students with a disability, basic skills assessment results will be compared to English-only peers with similar disabilities. Already, that's inclusive from the very beginning. We're not saying turn to page 7 for what we thought of last week for something that we've had in place for 24 years, right? So
when we have findings like this, that what is written versus what's practiced is perhaps still directing us towards issues of not having equity, it's important for us to be like, okay, I identified something that doesn't make me feel too good in my role or in my system, but guess what? It's an opportunity to take what was learned, reflect, and then make it better, right? So criteria 4, because it is locally determined, it's absolutely open for LEAs to take back to their ELAC and be like, okay, you know what, let's reconsider what's written here. Instead of writing just SBAC scores, right, which is, of course, up to the LEA to determine, locally determined, how do we make it more equitable, though, right? So a quick way to do it is scores will be compared to English-only peers with similar disabilities. Another one would be that basic skills, the assessment, it's not written out that it has to be the SBAC. It's really up to the LEAs. Some places do I-ready scores. Well, okay, yeah, so if you do I-ready scores, you know, the same language could be put in there. English-only peers, I-ready scores of English-only peers with similar disabilities, right? The SANDI is an assessment that's utilized in a lot of special education settings that allows you to disaggregate assessment data by disability category. So you can use the SANDI where you're comparing an English-only peer on the autism spectrum, or with SLD as a primary diagnosis, et cetera, and then compare that way. So again, writing it out from the get-go in an equitable and accessible manner is really the way to go when looking at the systems lens. And who can provide clarity in that? Multidisciplinary team members that might have the information that you might need to make these processes more equitable.
Right, yet another example why we need this dual lens, right? So you have that EL specialist lens who can contribute to the conversation about what is required, what is recommended, and what is locally determined. And you have, again, like we tag team this, right? Vanessa, who comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, for kiddos with disabilities, it's an equity issue if we're not comparing them with their peers with a similar disability. So we need both lenses, you know, when it comes to, especially particularly policies like the reclassification of
Can
English
you
learners.
share, Lupita, about the percentage of students who meet criteria 1, both with domain exemptions, without domain exemptions, and alternate LPAC? How many are not being reclassified? Because I think that's coming up also. Well, there's kids who aren't meeting criteria 1, but the research findings have been what? You could tell us?
Right, so recently, very recently, literally just a few months ago, the Department of Education sent out to all LEAs, all districts, data on who your kiddos are, your English learners who are eligible for reclassification, meaning students who have met the required criteria 1, which is an overall 4 on the LPAC, or an overall 3 on the alt LPAC for those kiddos who are eligible to take the alt LPAC. So that basically says these students have already demonstrated mastery of English language skills via the LPAC or alt LPAC, which are aligned to ELD standards. Check. They've demonstrated mastery. Yet they're not being reclassified because of the locally determined criteria. So the percentages, I'm going to be off a little bit, but they really are very, very close. First, there's about 80% of students who are taking the alternate LPAC who have met criteria 1, meaning they've demonstrated an overall 3. 3 is the highest score you can get on the alternate LPAC. And I want to say, I don't want to misspeak because this is being recorded, so if I misspeak, just know that I'm just drawing back on my memory. My memory hasn't been the best recently. I want to say it's up in the 40% that these are English learners that have met criteria 1. I'm talking statewide, guys, statewide, and yet are not being reclassified because the locally determined criteria is like, nope, they're not ready. Yet what we hear often is kids can't pass the LPAC. Well, actually they are. They really are passing the LPAC. They're demonstrating mastery, but it's the locally determined criteria. My guess is a lot of it has to do with criteria 4, you know, what you're bringing up. That is the barrier. So back to the infographic. This deep dive into your current policies and practices. What is written? What is actually happening? And at the end of the day, whether it's written and happening or written and not happening, what impact is that having on our dually identified students? Do we have anything in the chat, Vanessa, that we want to?
It was mostly related to criteria 1, how students still cannot meet it. So what I'm doing is, so we can move on with what we have remaining for this afternoon, is I'm going to drop in the chat our reclassification session, because that one does spend some time exploring the 3 pathways and what to do when students aren't quote unquote passing the LPAC, whether it be with accommodations, without accommodations, domain exemptions, or the alternate LPAC if a significant cognitive disability exists. So I'm going to drop that in the chat.
All right, thank you. So the reclassification process, as you can see, is a hot topic in and of itself, but I think it does fit into this part of the infographic. What is your policy for reclassification? And does it meet or address the needs of our dually identified students? Okay, so another section of the infographic that I want to draw our attention to is this element where at the end of the day, folks, first best instruction is going to be the best strategy, the best support for all of our kiddos. Because first best instruction, which comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 core instruction, is what's going to give the majority of our students what they need with those embedded supports. The kiddos that are falling through the cracks after first best instruction, best practices, research-based strategies, ELD instruction is consistent and coherent. Standards are what we utilize to guide our curriculum and our instruction. When all those pieces are in place, the majority of our students will thrive. And we'll be able to see the kiddos who will need additional supports, right? And that's where we move into our Tier 2 supports. And again, that's an issue of progress monitoring, right? We provide some supports. Okay, we're not meeting you where you are. Let's give you some additional support in the form of resources, in the form of time or a combination thereof. Let's try it out. Let's take the temperature and see how it's working. And if it's working fine, we'll fold you back into the Tier 1 without the Tier 2 supports. And the same case, you know, when kids are not succeeding, then you have that smaller percentage that will require Tier 3 supports. And yet still we're not talking about special education services. So when solid instruction, standards-based, best practices are implemented, your teachers are trained, your teachers are supported, they work together and collaboratively to address the needs of our students. I see more and more inquiries and training around co-teaching because folks are seeing, hey, there's some expertise in the special education department. Hey, there's some really cool training going on in general education. You know, let's join forces and let's work together. When first best instruction is on point, the majority of our students will benefit, with or without disabilities. They will benefit. So it's important for us to examine our current system of support. Are we going from mediocre instruction to IEP assessment, special education assessment? Because then we really are not making the best use of our time and resources. So it's important to take that into consideration. I'm going to move right into data, right? Data drives instruction, but data also drives systems. So this is just literally a snapshot of the different databases, student information systems that we can access data from. Conversations with some of the teams that we are working with, not everybody has access to all of this data. So if you're in special education, you may have access to SACE, but I'm not, so I don't have access to SACE, and so I don't know how to address the needs of the student unless you tell me, unless you reach out to me, unless we intentionally meet and take a look at what our students can do and what are the supports that they need. So it's important for us to become familiar with the different student information systems that the different programs use. Special education programs are using, here in Imperial Valley is SACE is, I think, what everybody's using, right? But there are other systems that are utilized across the state. So if you want to work more intentionally, if you're an administrator, you want to work more intentionally with your special education counterpart, maybe, you know, collaborating and taking a closer look at SACE, providing access so that we can take a look at what our students are able to do. Another resource that we recently created, that Vanessa recently created, is taking a look at the multidisciplinary teams, but at a regional level. We've had a really awesome opportunity to work with the regional English learner specialists. These are English learner coordinators and directors at different county offices in the state of California, and they are charged to provide support to their local schools, districts, and county offices on anything and everything related to English learners. We're working closely with them, building their capacity, collaborating with them, and building their regional multidisciplinary team. So we feel very honored to be able to contribute in building multidisciplinary teams at the state level. And really that's what brings us here today, is to really call out and validate your efforts in creating, nurturing, and expanding your multidisciplinary team, because we know we cannot do it individually. We cannot address the needs of all of our students in one bucket, right? It's not the sole responsibility of your general education teacher or administrators or special education teacher administrators or support staff. It truly is a collective commitment. And so we invite you to consider the resources that we shared with you. Think about where they might fit, what seems more feasible to begin to share and implement, depending on what your role is. We have some teen time questions that we're going to ask you to take with you as you spend some time really reflecting on the resources that we shared with you. And where might you begin to have these conversations to enhance and expand your multidisciplinary team? Because again, it does take a team lift. This is a collective commitment. The more we reach out to each other, the more we strive to learn from each other and join forces, the students are the ones that are going to benefit. And then our programs and systems will most definitely improve. We're going to ask you to give us some feedback. If this is the first time that you're with us today, and you missed the first 3 sessions, we ask you to give us feedback specifically on today. If you've been joining us and this is your 4th session, please give us feedback based on the series. We appreciate every single comment that you share with us, and please know that we absolutely take note of what you have shared and implement them into our services and support and resources moving forward. As you are doing that, I want to close off the day with one of my favorite people. She doesn't know she's one of my favorite people, but she is a short video from the one and only Shelley Moore. So please take these last couple of minutes to give us some feedback and enjoy.
Welcome to 5 More Minutes, helpful videos in 5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelley Moore, and today's episode is called United. Okay, wow, friends, I gotta tell you, you really stepped up to the plate on this one. Remember back to the very first 5 More Minute video, the evolution of inclusion? Today's topic is the evolution of inclusion. Do you remember I asked you all a question at the end? Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? What might that be? And let me tell you, you sure did tell me. The first response I got was from a mom. She said, Shelley, I have a son who's a little person, and all of these dots, they're the same size. One of those dots should be smaller because size matters. And I gotta say, the pleasantly plump 10-year-old inside of me totally agrees. So you know what I said to that mom? Yes, you're right. And then there was another person who said, yeah, but Shelly, what's with this solid black line around the dots? That should be a dotted line. What about virtual communities? Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then someone said, yeah, but Shelly, why is there only one bubble? If a person feels like they're included in one place, that's not enough. That's not inclusion. That's usually the last option. Inclusion means you have many communities that you feel safe and belong in. And you know what I said? Yes, absolutely. You're right. You're all right. And then I got this one. And this one really made me think. This guy said, Shelly, I can't commit to a color. Where's the intersectionality? And to add on that, another person agreed and said, what if we were all little Trivial Pursuit pies and all the little colors represent all of our identities? Yes! I love that one. It's perfect. So as you can see, this caused sleepless nights because all of these versions were better than mine. And so I knew I had to call Cousin Paul.
Oh, Shelly. Hey, Shelly, how are you?
Cousin Paul, I asked, we need to make another video. You know what he said? Let's do it. So I booked a plane ticket to New Jersey. And then guess what happened? The Tuesday before I left. A colleague came up to me with a big yellow bag. And this is what she said. Shelly, one of my students watched your video. And she's made you something that shows what she thinks the next evolution of inclusion is. In the bag was the most incredible mouth painting done by Megan, her student. Now, before I show you the painting, because obviously I'm going to show it to you, I'm going to read you what she said on the back. Megan says this, Shelly, I think the next evolution is united, because when we work together, we all become a part of each other. Here is Megan's painting. Megan is 12. Now, I know we talk a lot about inclusion. We've made a whole lot of videos. We've had a lot of conversations. We've asked a lot of questions. But it's all really leading to this. All of this is just talk, unless we actually take action. Megan is living inclusion. Her peers are living inclusion. Her school is living inclusion. They are taking action. So Megan, this is a shout out to you. Thank you for your painting. Thank you for your words. But most of all, thank you for teaching us why any of this matters. You are the reason why we do this work. You matter. And I want you to know that we will never stop working. So friends, if you're watching this, here's my challenge. Go find a Megan. And I want you to thank them. I want you to thank them for teaching us. And then I want you to decide how you're gonna take action. Because we need to take action and we can never stop moving for our Megans. So there you have it, another 5 more minutes. Let's keep in touch. Email, podcast, YouTube. Make sure you follow because this little community we're forming, this is a community that's never gonna stop moving. See you next time.
We want to thank you for being with us today, for joining us throughout this series, for exploring the resources and giving us feedback on what's working. Good luck. Adelante. Continue the good work, continue the good fight, and you know where to find us if you need some extra support. Take care of yourselves, keep in touch, and please, please, please don't leave without giving us some feedback. Any last words for the cause? All right, thank you so much. Take care.